On my 70th birthday, I asked my son to have dinner with me. He sent a rushed text saying he was drowning in a make-or-break corporate deadline just to keep a roof over his head. I went to our favorite upscale steakhouse by myself, nursing a black coffee. But on my way to the restroom, I found him. He was not working. He was at a VIP table laughing over $300 steaks and expensive champagne with his wife and her mother. What I did next left the entire restaurant in shock and completely destroyed their fake reality. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. My name is Leon Carter. I am 70 years old, and for the past decade, I have perfected the art of being invisible. I sat alone at a small corner table in the Oak Room, a dimly lit, high-end steakhouse right in the heart of Chicago. The restaurant smelled of aged leather, roasted garlic, and money. It used to be a tradition for Aaron and me to come here every year on my birthday. Just father and son. But traditions, it seems, have an expiration date when you become an inconvenience. The waiter, a young man with a sympathetic smile, approached my table for the third time. He asked if I was ready to order, or if I was still waiting for my party. I simply shook my head and asked for a black coffee. I could see the pity in his eyes. He saw exactly what I wanted the world to see, a weary, fixed-income retiree nursing a $3 beverage in a place where the appetizers cost more than my supposed weekly grocery budget. I looked down at my phone. The screen was dark now, but Aaron's text message was burned into my memory. Dad, I am so sorry. I am buried under a make-or-break corporate deadline. If I do not get this done, we might lose the house. Let us do a rain check. Happy 70th. Love you. I had replied, telling him not to worry about me, to focus on his work, and to take care of his family. I played the role of the understanding, undemanding father perfectly. I wore my faded gray suit, the one Aaron always complained made me look like an old mechanic holding on to the past. I sipped my bitter coffee and stared at my hands. They were rough, calloused hands. They were the hands that had built everything, but to Aaron, they were just the hands of an old man who needed to be managed. I sat there absorbing the quiet humiliation of being pushed aside. I did not complain. I did not call him back to argue. I just sat in the dim light, accepting my place at the bottom of his priority list. After about 20 minutes of listening to the clinking glasses and joyous laughter of other families celebrating around me, I stood up to use the restroom. The Oak Room is a sprawling restaurant with private alcoves and elevated VIP booths tucked away behind velvet curtains. As I walked down the carpeted hallway, a familiar burst of laughter caught my attention. It was a sharp, arrogant laugh that I had heard in my own living room 100 times. I stopped in my tracks. I stepped slightly to the side, concealing myself behind a large potted fern near the entrance of the VIP lounge. And there he was. My son Aaron. He was not hunched over a laptop. He was not stressing over a corporate deadline to save his home. He was sitting in the center of a plush leather booth, clinking a crystal flute of expensive vintage champagne. Next to him sat his wife Valerie, dripping in pearls and a silk evening dress. Across from them was Patricia, Valerie's mother, wearing her usual expression of supreme entitlement. My eyes immediately locked onto Aaron's left wrist. He was wearing the silver Rolex. The same Rolex he had cried to me about 3 years ago when he was supposedly drowning in credit card debt. He told me he was going to lose his car if he did not pay off the jeweler. I had silently paid off that debt, letting him believe it was a miraculous bank restructuring. I stood frozen, the noise of the restaurant fading away as I focused on their conversation. Patricia took a delicate sip of her champagne and let out a condescending sigh. She leaned forward, her voice carrying easily over the jazz music. Are you sure your father is not going to call and ruin our evening, Aaron? You know how needy he gets on these little milestones. Aaron laughed, swirling the golden liquid in his glass. Do not worry about the old man, Patricia. I told him I was buried in work. He bought it completely. He is probably sitting in his recliner right now watching reruns and eating canned soup, Valerie chimed in, her tone dripping with venom. Thank God. If I had to sit through another, listening to him talk about his days in the workshop, I would lose my mind. We need to start looking into that assisted living facility on the north side, Aaron. Seriously. He is becoming a financial burden, and I will not have his cheap lifestyle dragging down our social standing. Aaron nodded in agreement. I know, Val. We will get him into a home soon. He has a little bit of pension money saved up. We can use that to cover the initial fees, and once we sell his house, we can finally upgrade to the estate in the suburbs. Just be patient. Every word was a knife to the chest. But the pain only lasted for a fleeting second. It was quickly, violently replaced by a cold, absolute clarity. They were not just ignoring me. They were actively plotting to strip me of my dignity, my home, and my independence. They saw me as a dying cash cow ready for slaughter. I did not storm over in a rage. I did not yell. I straightened my faded gray jacket, rolled my shoulders back, and stepped out from behind the fern. I walked slowly and deliberately toward their table. The waiter had just set down 3 massive sizzling tomahawk steaks, easily $300 apiece. As I stepped into the light of their VIP booth, Patricia was the first to notice me. Her smug smile vanished, instantly replaced by a look of sheer terror. She dropped her fork. It clattered loudly against her porcelain plate. Valerie followed her mother's gaze and let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her chest. Finally, Aaron turned around. All the color drained from his face. He looked like a ghost. For a long, agonizing moment, the table was completely dead silent. The lively atmosphere of their little celebration evaporated into thin air. Dad, Aaron stammered, his voice cracking. Dad, what are you doing here? I thought I would treat myself to a quiet coffee for my 70th birthday. I said, my voice completely level. I did not expect to run into such an important corporate meeting. Is Patricia your new boss, Aaron, or is she the deadline you were so worried about? Aaron swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. Dad, listen, it is not what it looks like. This was a spontaneous client dinner. Valerie and Patricia just happened to be in the area, and they had to tag along to smooth things over with the accounts. It was a last-minute emergency. It was a pathetic, insulting lie. Before I could even respond to it, Valerie recovered her composure. She crossed her arms, her face hardening into a mask of pure disrespect. Leon, she said, not even addressing me as her father-in-law. You should not be sneaking around spying on us. And honestly, you shouldn't even be eating here. This place is way beyond your meager pension. You are going to embarrass Aaron in front of the staff. Why don't you just go home and not make a scene? We will bring you some leftovers tomorrow. She looked at me as if I were a stray dog that had wandered into a palace. She expected me to shrink back, to apologize for intruding on their high society life, to accept my place at the bottom of their shoes. I did not blow up. I did not flip the table. I simply smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the cold, calculated smile of a man who realizes he is dealing with absolute fools. Leftovers, I repeated softly. How incredibly generous of you, Valerie. I looked at Aaron, who was desperately avoiding my eyes. Enjoy your steaks, Aaron. Happy birthday to me. I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving them stewing in their own awkward, arrogant silence. I heard Patricia mutter something about me being a crazy old man as I walked away, but her words meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. I did not leave the restaurant immediately. Instead, I walked directly to the maitre d' at the front reception desk. He was an older gentleman in a sharp tuxedo, and he greeted me politely. I reached into the inner pocket of my faded jacket, past the worn leather wallet Aaron always made fun of, and pulled out a sleek, heavy, solid black metal card. It was a card no one in my family knew I possessed. A card that required a minimum net worth that would make Patricia's fake high society friends weep. I handed it to the maitre d'. His eyes widened slightly as he recognized the insignia, and his posture immediately became even more deferential. "How may I assist you this evening, sir?" he asked quietly. There is a party of 3 in the VIP booth in the back, I said, keeping my voice low. A young man named Aaron Carter and his guests. I would like to send something to their table. Please select your finest vintage wine, something in the $2,000 range. Have the sommelier open it and pour it for them. Right away, sir. Shall I put the entire dinner on your card as well? I smiled. Absolutely not. Just the wine. But I need you to deliver a handwritten note along with it. I took a pen from the desk and wrote a quick message on the back of a pristine white reservation card. I handed it to the maitre d' along with my black card to cover the wine. He ran the transaction in seconds, handed my card back with a respectful nod, and went to execute my instructions. I stepped out of the heavy oak doors of the steakhouse and into the cool evening air. I did not look back. Before leaving the restaurant, I stepped into the quiet vestibule and called Fletcher. Aaron's premium card appeared to be personal, but the issuer had approved its extraordinary limit because one of my shadow trusts guaranteed the account. I had created that arrangement years earlier when Aaron claimed the card was necessary for corporate travel. I told Fletcher to withdraw the trust, guarantee immediately, and instruct the issuer to suspend new charges pending a collateral review. I also ordered the next morning's automatic transfer canceled. Fletcher did not freeze Aaron's independently earned money. He removed my property and my guarantees from the system supporting him. By the time I reached the curb, the card issuer had acknowledged the collateral withdrawal. 10 minutes later, the sommelier would approach Aaron's booth with the $2,000 bottle and my handwritten note. Enjoy the client meeting. Your safety net is officially cut. When the dinner check arrived, Aaron would present the premium card he believed represented his own success. The issuer would decline the charge because the extraordinary credit line no longer had its guarantor. The following morning, he would discover that the monthly transfer supporting his mortgage had also been canceled. The collapse would not be caused by me stealing his money. It would be caused by the sudden absence of mine. The sun rose over Chicago, painting my modest living room in shades of pale gold. I woke up at exactly 6 in the morning, just as I had for the past 40 years. I walked into my small, dated kitchen and brewed a pot of generic store-bought coffee. The house was completely silent. It was a comfortable, heavy silence. The kind of silence that belongs to a man who finally has nothing left to hide and absolutely nothing left to lose. I sat in my worn-out armchair, watching the steam rise from my ceramic mug. I did not feel angry anymore. The sharp, violent sting of betrayal from the night before had completely vanished from my chest, leaving behind a cold, absolute focus. I knew exactly what was coming today. I knew the exact sequence of events that would unfold because I had engineered them with total precision. At precisely 8:15, my cell phone began to vibrate on the wooden coffee table. I let it. The screen flashed brightly with Aaron's name. I watched the phone buzz across the scratched surface until it finally went to voicemail. Less than 10 seconds later, it started ringing again, then a third time, then a fourth. He was frantic. I took another slow sip of my black coffee, savoring the bitter roasted taste on my tongue, before I finally reached over and accepted the call. I did not say hello. I just brought the phone to my ear and breathed evenly into the receiver. Dad. Aaron's voice exploded through the tiny speaker. He was entirely out of breath, panting heavily, as if he had just sprinted a full mile in a panic. His smooth, arrogant corporate tone from the steakhouse was completely gone, erased by pure terror. Dad, are you there? You need to answer me right now. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting just a touch of elderly confusion seep into my tone. Good morning, Aaron. It is a bit early for a phone call, isn't it? Did you enjoy the rest of your spontaneous client meeting last night? I ignored the jab entirely. The blind panic in his voice was far too thick for him to care about his pride or the events of the previous evening. Dad, something is wrong with the bank. The transfers did not go through. I checked my banking application this morning, and all my primary accounts are locked. The scheduled deposit bounced completely. What did you do? For the past 3 years, I had been funneling exactly $7,500 a month into a secure shadow account that fed directly into Aaron's primary checking balance. I set this massive safety net up when he bought that sprawling 5-bedroom house in the wealthy suburbs, a house he purchased solely to impress his demanding wife, Valerie, and her terribly arrogant mother, Patricia. Aaron had come to me crying in my kitchen back then, saying the mortgage company was demanding a larger proof of income to close the deal. I set up the automated transfers to keep his head above water. He told Valerie he had received a massive executive promotion at his firm. He built his entire identity as a highly successful provider on the silent backbone of my invisible labor. And now the spine of his fake luxury life had just snapped in half. I frowned, making sure to sound totally bewildered. Transfers? What transfers, Aaron? I do not know what you are talking about. I am just sitting here drinking my morning coffee. He let out a desperate, pathetic noise. It sounded like a sob trapped deep in his throat. Do not play dumb with me, Dad. The first of the month deposits. The auto-pay for my massive mortgage triggered this morning, and it hit a solid wall of insufficient funds. My bank is already hitting me with severe overdraft penalties. You need to call your bank right now and authorize the release of those funds. I sighed heavily, projecting the weary, tired tone of a poor, retired man. Oh, son, you know how I struggle with all this modern banking technology. I am just an old man living on my meager pension. Maybe the government had a glitch with my small retirement check today. You know how incredibly tight things are for me. I can barely afford to eat at those nice fancy restaurants you and your mother-in-law frequent. That pushed him straight over the edge. The desperate, pleading son vanished, and the entitled, spoiled brat took over. Stop talking about the restaurant. Stop talking about your fake pension. Aaron screamed into the phone. I need that money, Dad. The mortgage is due today. The lease payments on both luxury cars are due tomorrow. Valerie just booked a premium contractor to completely remodel our backyard, and they are expecting the massive cash deposit by noon today. If that money does not hit my account by 12 o'clock, everything is going to bounce. Everything will be ruined. I leaned back deeply into my armchair. I listened to his rapid, heavy breathing echoing through the phone. It was fascinating to hear the absolute destruction of his fragile ego in real time. But Aaron, I replied softly, I simply do not understand any of this. You are a highly successful corporate executive. You were just celebrating a major business deal last night with Patricia and Valerie over $300 steaks. Surely a man of your incredible financial standing does not need his old burden of a father to pay his bills. You told Patricia I was a financial drain on your social standing. Why would a wealthy, powerful man like you need pennies from a burdensome old man? There was a long, agonizing silence on the line. I could hear him frantically pacing back and forth. I could hear the panicked squeak of his expensive leather shoes squealing against his imported hardwood floors. Dad, please. He was openly begging now. His voice was reduced to a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. Please. Valerie does not know. She thinks I get a monthly corporate bonus. If the house payment bounces, she will see the bank fraud alerts on her phone. Patricia is staying with us for another 2 weeks. If they find out the money is gone, they will leave me. You know exactly how Valerie is about status and money. She will take my wife away, and she will leave me with absolutely nothing. I closed my eyes. A father is supposed to feel a sharp pain in his chest when his child cries. But I felt absolutely nothing. The boy I raised died the very moment he sat at that VIP table and laughed while those 2 women planned to lock me away in a care facility and steal my home. I opened my eyes and stared blankly at the empty wall across the room. That sounds like a terrible situation, Aaron. I said, my voice dropping the confused old man act entirely. My tone was now freezing cold and sharp as a razor. It sounds like you built a giant house of cards on a foundation of miserable lies. It sounds like you bought a life you could never actually afford, just to impress women who do not genuinely love you. Dad, I am begging you on my hands and knees. He was openly sobbing through the speaker now. Just unlock the account for today. Just send this single month's payment so I can survive the week. I will figure it all out next month, I swear to you. I will get a second job. I will downsize the cars. Just do not do this to me today. Valerie will completely ruin my life. I took a deep, steadying breath. Aaron, you looked your wife in the eye and agreed that I was a cheap embarrassment to your family. You told your mother-in-law that you were going to shove me into an assisted living facility and sell my modest home to upgrade your own estate. You sat there in your tailored suit and toasted to my demise with $2,000 champagne. A bottle of champagne, I might add, that you could not even pay for once I left the building. I am not going to unlock the account, Aaron. There is no bank glitch. There is no technological error. I cut the cord. You wanted so badly to be a big-shot corporate executive. Now is your chance to figure out how to actually be one. No, please, Dad, do not hang up on me. Through the receiver, I heard a door slam open in the background of his house. I heard Valerie screaming his name from down the hall, furiously asking him why the credit card company was calling her personal phone about a declined payment. The panic in his environment was descending into absolute chaos. I am going to enjoy my cheap canned soup today, Aaron, I said quietly into the phone. Good luck with your corporate deadlines. I pulled the phone away from my ear and ended the call. I set the device face down on the wooden coffee table and picked up my mug. The coffee was still warm, and it had never tasted better. The ride to the financial district was quiet and deeply methodical. I wore the exact same faded gray suit I had worn to the steakhouse the night before. To the strangers passing by on the bustling Chicago sidewalks, I was just another invisible old man riding the early morning city bus. They saw a tired retiree clutching a battered leather briefcase making his way slowly through the morning crowd. None of them could possibly know that the battered briefcase held the power to shatter an entire dynasty of arrogant lies. I walked past the towering glass facades of the downtown corporate centers, watching the young executives rush by with their expensive coffees tubs and tailored winter coats. They reminded me so much of Aaron. They walked with that same unearned arrogance and that same blind confidence that the world owed them everything simply because they dressed the part. I turned a corner and approached the towering black marble building that housed one of the most elite wealth management firms in the entire Midwest. The revolving doors were heavy and trimmed in polished brass. I pushed through them, stepping into a pristine lobby that smelled of expensive cologne and quiet, untouchable money. The receptionist at the vast marble front desk was completely new. She looked up from her glowing computer screen, and her eyes immediately tracked my scuffed brown shoes and my severely out-of-date jacket. She offered me a polite but deeply condescending smile. It was the exact kind of dismissive smile Valerie gave me whenever I brought a cheap grocery store cake to their lavish neighborhood dinner parties. She asked if I was lost and if I needed help finding the public transit station down the street. I did not raise my voice or show any sign of intimidation. I simply placed my rough hand on the cool marble counter and told her I was there to see Fletcher. Her polite smile faltered. She told me Mr. Fletcher was the senior managing partner of the firm and absolutely did not take walk-in appointments from the general public. I told her to pick up her phone and tell him that Leon Carter was standing in the lobby. She hesitated, clearly annoyed by my persistence, but she picked up the receiver anyway. I watched her expression transform from irritation to absolute panic in a matter of seconds. She slammed the phone down and stood up so fast her expensive rolling chair hit the back wall. She frantically apologized while rushing out from behind the desk to personally usher me toward the private executive elevators. The heavy metal doors opened directly into a sprawling penthouse suite overlooking the entire city skyline. Fletcher was already standing by his massive mahogany desk waiting for me. Fletcher is a man who deals with billionaires, politicians, and old money heirs every single day of his life. Yet when I walked into his office, he immediately crossed the room and shook my hand, with a level of profound respect he reserved for very few people. He locked the heavy oak doors behind us, ensuring absolute privacy for our meeting. I sat down in a plush leather armchair and placed my worn briefcase on his immaculate glass table. Fletcher poured 2 glasses of sparkling water and took a seat opposite me. He noted that I was rarely seen in the downtown office and asked what had brought me out of my quiet suburban neighborhood. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city below us. For most of the city, I was still Leon Carter, a retired mechanic living in the same modest house he had occupied for decades. Fletcher knew the fuller truth. During my years in the automotive trade, I had designed and patented a pneumatic pressure valve that became standard equipment in major manufacturing plants. The licensing income had accumulated quietly for decades through trusts and investment portfolios Fletcher managed on my behalf. Aaron knew none of the details. That secrecy had once been intended to give him the freedom to build a life without the distortions created by inherited wealth. Whether that decision had protected him or merely allowed his entitlement to grow unnoticed was a question I was not yet ready to answer. For now, I gave Fletcher only the facts that mattered. The financial support was ending, and every hidden structure attached to Aaron's lifestyle had to be dismantled. I turned my attention back to Fletcher. I told him that the decades-long experiment was officially over. I explained the events of the previous night in excruciating detail. I told him about the upscale steakhouse and the $300 meals. I described the champagne toasts and the horrific conversation I had overheard from behind the velvet curtain. I told him how my own son had agreed to strip me of my dignity and lock me away in an assisted living facility just to steal the modest home I built with my late wife. Fletcher sat perfectly still, his face hardening into a terrifying mask of professional fury. He had managed my estate for 20 years and knew exactly how much I had sacrificed to give Aaron a quiet, stable foundation. I opened my battered briefcase and pulled out a stack of financial documents. I instructed Fletcher to execute a total and immediate freeze on every single shadow trust attached to Aaron. The monthly automated transfers were already stopped, but I wanted the safety nets completely burned to ash. I ordered him to permanently dissolve the emergency credit lines, the secret mortgage backing, and the hidden collateral portfolios that had allowed Aaron to leverage millions of dollars in personal loans. I wanted Aaron completely isolated and operating solely on his own actual corporate salary. I knew for a fact his real salary could barely cover the exorbitant property taxes on his sprawling suburban mansion. Fletcher nodded, taking rapid notes with brutal efficiency. He confirmed that by the end of the business day, Aaron would be entirely cut off from the invisible empire that had been artificially propping up his entire arrogant existence. Once the banks realized the silent collateral was gone, they would panic. They would demand immediate full balance payments on his luxury vehicles and his premium credit cards. The financial dominoes were perfectly lined up to crush him, but stopping. Aaron was only the beginning of my visit. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany desk. I told Fletcher that the freeze was merely a defensive maneuver. Now it was time to go on the offensive. I brought up Valerie and her mother, Patricia, the 2 women who had sat in that VIP booth and openly mocked my cheap lifestyle while calculating exactly how much cash they could squeeze from my supposed modest pension. I wanted to know absolutely everything about them. I instructed Fletcher to unleash his absolute best forensic accountants. I wanted a complete microscopic deep dive into Patricia and Valerie. I wanted to see their real estate holdings, their offshore liabilities, their credit utilization, and their hidden debts. People who flaunt their wealth as loudly and obnoxiously as Patricia usually have the most terrifying skeletons buried deep in their financial closets. They rely entirely on the grand illusion of limitless capital to intimidate others, but the brutal math of accounting never lies. Fletcher smiled a sharp, predatory smile. He told me that his specialized team could crack open their entire financial history within 24 hours. He promised to ruthlessly trace every single dollar they had borrowed, spent, or stolen over the last decade. I told him I did not just want to see their debts. I wanted to own them. I wanted to know exactly who held the paper on Patricia and her lavish estate so I could prepare to pull the rug completely out from under her feet at the worst possible moment. We spent the next 2 hours mapping out the total financial destruction of the people who thought I was a helpless fool. I finished my sparkling water and stood up to leave the office. Fletcher stood with me, offering a solemn, respectful nod of understanding. He promised to call me the very moment his accountants unearthed Patricia and Valerie and their darkest financial secrets. I picked up my old scuffed briefcase, feeling dramatically lighter than I had in years. For a decade, I had carried the massive, suffocating weight of protecting a son who secretly despised me. I had shielded him from the harsh realities of the world, hoping he would eventually grow into a man of honor. But Aaron chose a life of fake luxury and venomous lies. As I walked back to the private executive elevator, I looked at my reflection in the polished brass doors. I no longer saw a tired old man holding on to the painful memories of the past. I saw a titan who was finally ready to stop holding back. The elevator doors closed quietly, sealing the absolute fate of a family that had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They wanted to steal from a poor, retired mechanic. They had no idea they had just declared a brutal war on a man who owned the very ground they walked on. The afternoon sun was casting long, heavy shadows across my modest living room when the doorbell finally rang. I was sitting in my favorite worn armchair, enjoying the absolute quiet of my home after my highly productive meeting downtown. I knew they were coming because desperation is an incredibly predictable emotion. When a man realizes his entire fake empire is collapsing, he will always run back to the source he has been draining. I marked my page in my book and slowly lifted myself from the chair, making sure my movements looked a little stiffer and more pained than they actually were. I shuffled across the woven rug to the front door and opened it to find Aaron and Valerie standing on my porch. Aaron looked absolutely terrible. The confident, arrogant corporate executive who had laughed at me in the steakhouse the night before had been entirely replaced by a man hovering on the absolute edge of a nervous breakdown. His expensive, tailored suit looked slept in, and there were deep, dark circles under his eyes. He had spent the entire morning watching his artificial financial world dry up, and he was physically shaking from the stress. Valerie, on the other hand, looked perfectly put together. She wore a pristine beige cashmere sweater and an expression of weaponized sweetness that made my stomach turn. In her hands, she carried a transparent plastic box containing a generic vanilla cake from the discount grocery store down the street. It even had a bright yellow clearance sticker slapped right on the front of the lid. Valerie pushed her way inside the house before I could even invite them in, holding the cheap cake up like a grand peace offering. She told me they simply had to come by and properly celebrate my birthday, since last night was such a silly, unfortunate misunderstanding. She marched into my dining room and placed the plastic box on my heavy wooden table with a loud thud. I looked at the miserable clearance cake and then at her massive diamond rings. The sheer audacity of bringing a $5 expiring dessert to apologize to the man whose bank accounts they were currently attempting to drain was almost poetic in its cruelty. I played my part flawlessly, letting my shoulders slump as I offered a weak, wobbly smile. I thanked them for going out of their way for a tired old man. Aaron let out a loud, forced laugh that sounded completely hollow, echoing terribly in the quiet house. He slapped his hand on my shoulder and launched into a heavily rehearsed speech. He told me he felt terrible about how things unfolded at the restaurant. He claimed the client he was entertaining was incredibly demanding, and that Patricia had only tagged along because she was a silent investor in the project. He spun a ridiculous, desperate web of lies, explaining that his stress levels were just too high, and he had completely lost track of his manners when he saw me. He kept talking rapidly, clearly, trying to fill the silent air in the room so I would not have time to ask any real questions. He told me he was so incredibly distracted by his massive corporate workload that he had not even realized there was a banking glitch affecting his personal accounts this morning. He casually mentioned that he hoped my small pension check cleared soon so I would not have to worry about my own daily bills. He was aggressively fishing for information, trying to figure out if I had caught on to the frozen funds, or if I truly was just a confused victim of a random bank error. I maintained a blank, innocent expression, looking back at him with wide, tired eyes. I told him the bank representative said it might take a few days to sort out my small pension issue, and that I was just going to tighten my belt and eat soup until then. Aaron swallowed hard. The color completely drained from his face at the mention of a few days. He needed that money today to stop the catastrophic domino effect of his bouncing loans. He looked at Valerie with sheer panic flashing in his eyes. Valerie stepped in smoothly, transitioning the conversation away from the dangerous territory of immediate cash. She walked around my living room, running her manicured fingers over the backs of my old chairs and looking at the framed family photographs on the mantel. She sighed heavily, putting on her absolute best concerned daughter-in-law performance. She turned to me with sad, sympathetic eyes and told me that seeing me struggle with bank errors and living alone in this big, empty house simply broke her heart. She said Aaron and she had been talking all morning about how much they constantly worried about my daily safety. She gestured to the hallway and the wooden stairs, talking about how dangerous a simple fall could be for someone my age. She painted a vivid, terrifying picture of me being alone and helpless in a home that was simply too large and outdated for an elderly man to manage by himself. I nodded slowly, looking down at my worn shoes. I told her the house did feel very large these days, especially since Aaron lost his mother. I played the part of the lonely, grieving widower, perfectly giving her the exact emotional opening she had come here to exploit. Valerie smiled a soft, predatory smile that did not reach her cold eyes. She walked over and gently took my rough hands in hers. She told me I did not have to carry this heavy burden alone anymore. She said they had found a beautiful, cozy, assisted living community just 30 minutes away. It had doctors on call 24 hours a day and a lovely cafeteria where I would never have to worry about cooking or cleaning ever again. Aaron chimed in, stepping closer to us to close the trap. He told me it was a premium facility and that I deserved to be taken care of properly in my final years. But then he introduced the financial catch. He explained that the facility was quite expensive and that my modest pension would never cover the monthly care fees. He looked at the floor briefly before meeting my eyes with a look of extreme fake sincerity. He told me he had a brilliant solution to protect me and ensure I lived my remaining years in total comfort without ever worrying about money. Valerie picked up the pitch without missing a single beat. She told me that the housing market was incredibly unpredictable right now, and dealing with buyers would be far too stressful for my heart. She suggested that instead of dealing with the nightmare of real estate agents, I should simply sign the deed of my house over to them today. She explained that if they took legal ownership of the property, they could manage my assets for me. They would leverage the house to pay for my care facility and ensure I was totally protected. They were offering to take away all my stress in exchange for signing away everything I owned so they could liquidate my home to save their own sinking ship. I looked around the house I had built with my own two hands. I looked at the walls that held decades of honest memories. They wanted to shove me into a facility and flip my home to cover the massive debts they were accumulating in the wealthy suburbs. They truly thought I was a senile, weak-old man who would just nod and sign away my life out of fear and loneliness. I felt a deep, freezing calm wash over my entire body. I knew exactly how to handle them. I pulled my hands away from Valerie gently, pretending to be completely overwhelmed by their incredible generosity. I let a small fake tear form in the corner of my eye. I told them I was incredibly touched by how much they cared about my future. I said the thought of moving was very scary, but having my own son manage my complicated affairs sounded like a massive relief. Aaron let out a huge breath he had been holding. The tension visibly melted from his shoulders. He thought he had just won the lottery. He thought he had just secured the massive collateral he needed to save his fake luxury life from total ruin. Aaron eagerly reached into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He claimed he had printed them out just in case I was open to the beautiful idea. He told me it was just some standard preliminary paperwork to transfer the deed and give him basic financial oversight so he could start making arrangements with the care facility this afternoon. He placed the papers on the dining table right next to the miserable clearance cake and handed me a shiny silver pen. I looked at the pen and then at the eager, desperate faces of my son and his wife. I picked up the papers and squinted at them, pretending I could barely read the small print without my missing reading glasses. I told them my eyes were just too tired today and that I needed a little time to look them over properly. I promised I would read through every single page tonight and that we could finalize everything very soon. Valerie tried to push back immediately. She told me the facility had a strict waiting list and that we needed to lock in my spot by the end of the day. She urged me to just sign the back page so they could get the legal ball rolling and save me a room. But I simply shook my head and maintained my gentle, stubborn old man persona. I told her I never sign anything without a good night of sleep and a fresh cup of coffee. I patted the stack of papers and assured them they had absolutely nothing to worry about. Aaron looked like he wanted to scream out loud. He needed the transfer finalized today so he could leverage my house against his bouncing mortgage payments. But he knew pushing too hard might scare off the confused old man he thought he was successfully manipulating. He forced a tight, painful smile and agreed to let me review the documents overnight. He told me he would call me first thing tomorrow morning to pick up the signed papers. I walked them to the front door, thanking them again for the lovely grocery store cake and their incredible concern for my well-being. Valerie gave me another stiff, fake hug, and Aaron patted my back before they practically ran down the driveway toward their expensive leased car. I watched them drive away from my porch window, feeling nothing but cold resolve. As soon as their car turned the corner out of sight, I walked back into the dining room. I picked up the legal documents Aaron had left behind. They were aggressively predatory, designed to strip me of all my rights instantly. I dropped the papers directly into the kitchen trash can, right on top of the bright yellow clearance sticker from their miserable cake. The trap was perfectly set, and they were walking right into it. The heavy wooden door clicked shut. I stood perfectly still in my foyer, listening to the frantic crunch of gravel as Aaron reversed his luxury sedan out of my driveway. The moment the sound of their engine faded into the distant suburban hum, I dropped the trembling old man routine completely. I rolled my shoulders, feeling the tension snap and release. I walked straight to the kitchen counter where I had left my mobile phone. It was already flashing with an incoming call from the private downtown number I knew by heart. I answered the call and brought the phone to my ear. Fletcher did not bother with pleasantries. His voice was sharp-clipped and practically vibrating with an energy I had not heard from him in years. He told me I needed to sit down. He said his team of forensic accountants had just cracked open the financial histories of Valerie and her mother, Patricia, and what they found inside was nothing short of catastrophic. I pulled a stool from the kitchen island and sat looking out the window into my quiet backyard. I told Fletcher to give me the exact numbers. I wanted to know exactly how deep the rot went. Fletcher began the autopsy of their fake high society lives. He started with Valerie. My daughter-in-law projected the image of a wealthy heiress, accustomed to the absolute finest things in life. She treated everyone around her like the help. But her reality was built on suffocating toxic debt. Fletcher explained that Valerie had completely maxed out 4 separate premium credit cards, all hidden in a secret account Aaron knew nothing about. She was drowning in over $80,000 of high-interest consumer debt just to keep up appearances with her country club friends. She was buying designer clothes, wearing them once for social media, and then quietly selling them to consignment shops to make the minimum monthly payments on her cards. But Valerie was just a small symptom of a much larger disease. Fletcher took a deep breath and moved on to Patricia. Patricia, the woman who had sat in that velvet VIP booth, sipping vintage champagne and mocking my cheap lifestyle, was completely and utterly broke. Her entire existence was a carefully constructed financial mirage. Fletcher revealed that Patricia did not actually own the massive sprawling estate in the wealthy suburbs. She had leveraged it 3 times over. She was surviving on a toxic cycle of bridge loans, taking out massive high-interest cash advances from private lenders just to pay off the interest on her previous loans. It was a classic shell game, a desperate, pathetic Ponzi scheme designed to maintain the illusion of generational wealth. I sat in the quiet of my kitchen, letting the absolute irony wash over me. Patricia had called me a financial burden. She had looked at my faded suit and deemed me unworthy of sitting in the same restaurant as her. Yet her entire life was a house of cards, waiting for a single gust of wind to blow it straight into federal bankruptcy court. I asked Fletcher why they were suddenly so desperate. Why Aaron and Valerie had practically broken down my front door with grocery store cake, trying to steal the deed to my modest home today. Fletcher delivered the lethal blow. He told me Patricia's house of cards had finally collapsed. Her primary private creditor, a ruthless holding company that specialized in high-risk wealth management, had officially called in her largest bridge loan. The balloon payment was completely due. She owed them just over $900,000 in pure liquid cash. If she did not produce that money by the end of the week, the holding company was going to publicly foreclose on her lavish estate. They were going to seize her assets, empty her accounts, and drag her name through the absolute mud of the local high society gossip circles. Patricia would be exposed as a complete fraud. Valerie was panicking, because if her mother went down, the entire facade went down with her. Valerie would lose her fake inheritance, her social standing, and her arrogant pride. That was the real reason they needed my house. They did not care about putting me in a comfortable assisted living facility. They did not care about managing my assets for my own safety. They needed to force me to sign over the deed to my home so they could immediately liquidate the property. They planned to sell the house I built with my late wife to a cash buyer at a massive discount and funnel every single penny directly to Patricia to stop the impending foreclosure. They were going to leave me rotting in a state-run facility while they used my life savings to save a woman who despised the very ground I walked on. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. A cold, calculated rage settled deep into my bones. For 40 years, I had worked in a filthy, sweltering auto shop. I had destroyed my hands and sacrificed my own comfort to ensure my son would never know the terrifying panic of poverty. I had silently funded his life, believing I was giving him a foundation to build his own honor. Instead, he had allowed 2 venomous women to convince him to sacrifice his own father to pay for their fake luxury. Fletcher remained silent on the other end of the line, waiting for my command. He knew exactly the kind of man I was. He knew I was not going to simply block their access and walk away. I asked Fletcher, who owned the holding company that held Patricia's debt. He gave me the name of a mid-sized aggressive firm based out of New York. I told him I did not just want to defend my home. I wanted to control the entire battlefield. I instructed Fletcher to use one of my invisible offshore proxy corporations to approach the New York firm immediately. I wanted him to purchase Patricia's entire debt portfolio. I did not care what it cost. I wanted to buy the absolute rights to her bridge loan. Fletcher let out a low, sharp laugh. It was the sound of a man watching a master chess player execute a flawless checkmate. He verified my instructions perfectly. By purchasing the debt, I would become Patricia's primary creditor. I would hold the absolute legal right to foreclose on her sprawling estate. I would own the very roof over her arrogant head, and she would have absolutely no idea it was me until the moment I decided to tear it down. I told Fletcher to move fast. I wanted the debt acquisition finalized within 48 hours. I wanted the paperwork locked tight behind layers of corporate anonymity. They thought they were playing a game with a confused, tired old man. I was going to let them keep believing that exact lie. I was going to let them continue digging their own miserable graves until the dirt was so high they could not possibly climb out. Fletcher promised this transaction would be executed by morning. He warned me that Aaron and Valerie would likely escalate their tactics once they realized the deed to my house was not transferring as fast as they needed. He told me to be incredibly careful. Desperate people do terrible things when the walls start closing in. I thanked Fletcher and ended the call. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade, casting the kitchen in a cool gray light. I walked over to the trash can and looked down at the predatory legal documents Aaron had tried to force me to sign. They were resting right on top of the ruined clearance cake. It was the perfect visual representation of their entire plan, cheap, thoughtless, and fundamentally insulting. I reached in and pulled the documents out of the trash. I smoothed the wrinkled edges and laid them flat on the kitchen island. I was not going to throw them away. I was going to use them. If they wanted to play a high-stakes game of legal manipulation, I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. But I was going to rewrite the rules. I walked to my home office and opened my heavy iron safe. I pulled out a blank stack of legally binding decoy documents Fletcher had drafted for me years ago just for emergencies. I was going to prepare a very special surprise for my son and his vicious wife. A surprise that would make their upcoming public humiliation the most devastating moment of their entire miserable lives. The titans of high society were about to learn a very hard lesson about the quiet man they had so foolishly underestimated. The morning light was perfectly clear when the sound of an expensive engine broke the quiet of my street. I was sitting at the dining table sipping my black coffee. Resting under my hands was the stack of papers Aaron had left the day before, along with the specialized documents Fletcher had couriered to me late last night. I had spent the dark hours of the early morning carefully integrating Fletcher's documents into Aaron's legal packet. They looked completely identical. The same heavy white paper. The same formal typography. The same intimidating legal jargon. But the words on those pages were a lethal trap. The doorbell rang twice in rapid succession. Aaron was impatient. I took a slow breath, letting the posture of a weary, defeated old man settle into my bones. I hunched my shoulders slightly and dragged my feet as I walked to the front door. When I opened it, Aaron was standing there wearing a freshly pressed navy suit. He held a leather briefcase tight against his chest. His smile was so wide and artificial, it looked like a mask glued to his face. He asked how I slept and stepped inside without waiting for an answer. I was moving with a frantic, manic energy fueled entirely by his desperate need for my money. I led him into the dining room. He immediately zeroed in on the stack of papers on the table. His eyes locked onto them with pure, unadulterated greed. He sat down across from me, folding his hands together, in a poor imitation of a caring, concerned son. He softened his voice, putting on a patronizing tone you might use to calm a frightened child. He told me that he and Valerie had stayed up all night talking about my future. He said they were deeply worried about my declining state and my advanced age. He actually used those exact words, declining state. He sat in the house I paid for, wearing clothes I had essentially financed, and told me I was losing my mind. He pulled a sleek silver pen from his jacket pocket and slid it across the table toward me. He explained that these documents were just standard medical and financial power of attorney forms. He lied straight to my face, telling me it was simply a precaution. He claimed that if I ever got sick or confused, he needed the legal authority to pay my medical bills and manage my upkeep. He promised that nothing would change in my daily life. He said he just wanted to protect my modest savings from greedy real estate agents and expensive nursing homes. The sheer audacity of his lies was breathtaking. He was projecting his exact crimes onto imaginary enemies to make himself look like my savior. I picked up the silver pen. I let my hand tremble just enough to make it look authentic. I looked up at him with wide, uncertain eyes. I asked him if signing these papers meant I would lose control of my house. I asked him if this meant I had to move into that facility Valerie kept talking about. I gave him one final, absolute chance to tell the truth. I gave him one last opportunity to look at his father and choose honor over greed. Aaron did not even hesitate. He reached across the table and placed his hand over mine, offering a comforting squeeze. He looked me dead in the eyes and promised that I would never lose my home. He swore on his own life that this paperwork was only an insurance policy to keep me safe and comfortable. He told me he loved me and that he would never do anything to hurt me. It was the most flawless, empty lie I had ever heard. I nodded slowly, pulling my hand out from under his. I lowered the tip of the pen to the signature line on the final page. I thought about my late wife, Martha. I thought about the days we spent building our lives from absolutely nothing. Martha always warned me that handing a man unearned wealth was like handing a child a loaded weapon. She said money does not change a man, it simply unmasks him. As I stared at Aaron sitting across from me, I realized Martha was completely right. My secret wealth had not corrupted my son. It had simply revealed the hollow, greedy parasite he had always been. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name. I flipped to the next page and signed again. I repeated the process until every single required signature line was filled. Aaron let out a massive, heavy sigh of relief. It was the sound of a drowning man finally breaking the surface of the water. He watched my pen strokes like a starving animal watching a meal. He had absolutely no idea what he had just witnessed. The document I signed was not the unrestricted instrument Aaron believed he had obtained. Fletcher had replaced the predatory draft with a lawful springing power of attorney. It could become active only if 2 independent physicians certified that I lacked capacity, and Fletcher confirmed the activation in writing. Even then, it prohibited gifts transfers to family members, changes to my trusts, the sale of my house, or any transaction benefiting Aaron, Valerie, or Patricia. The original remained in Fletcher's vault. Aaron received only a certified control copy whose serial number allowed every attempted use to be traced. If Aaron presented the document honestly, the bank would tell him it was inactive. The trap depended on what he did next. To steal from me, he would have to conceal the activation conditions, falsely claim I was incapacitated, or alter the packet. Those actions, not the paper itself, would create the fraud evidence. Aaron snatched the papers off the table before the ink was even fully dry. He hastily shoved them into his leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a sharp, definitive click. He could not completely hide the massive, triumphant grin spreading across his face. He believed he had just legally stolen my home and my entire life savings. He believed he was walking out of my house with the absolute power to liquidate my life and hand the cash over to his arrogant mother-in-law, Patricia. He stood up so quickly, his chair scraped loudly against the wooden floor. He told me he had to rush straight to the office to handle a major emergency, but he promised he and Valerie would take me out for a nice dinner very soon to celebrate. He said we would go somewhere quiet and affordable so I would not feel out of place. He was mocking me again, twisting the knife one last time before he left. I stood up slowly and walked him to the front door. I told him to drive safely and to be very careful with those important documents. I said I trusted him completely to do exactly what needed to be done. Aaron smiled a wide, genuine smile of pure, unadulterated greed. He told me not to worry about a single thing. He stepped out onto the porch and practically sprinted down the driveway toward his luxury sedan. He threw his briefcase into the passenger seat and sped away, peeling out of my quiet neighborhood as fast as his expensive engine would allow. I stood on my porch and watched his car disappear around the corner. The morning air was crisp and cool. The neighborhood was perfectly peaceful. I turned around and walked back inside my house, closing the heavy wooden door behind me. I walked to the kitchen and picked up my phone. I dialed Fletcher's private number. He answered on the very first ring. I told Fletcher the bait had been taken. Aaron had the decoy documents in his possession, and he was undoubtedly rushing straight to the banks to secure the bridge loans he desperately needed. Fletcher confirmed that his legal team was already on high alert, monitoring the shadow tripwires at every major financial institution in the city. The trap was officially set. Aaron thought he was the master manipulator pulling the strings of a confused old man. But he was just a desperate rat running blindly through a maze I had built exclusively for his destruction. I poured myself another cup of black coffee and sat back down in my armchair. I just had to wait for the alarm to sound. The first domino had officially been pushed, and when it finally fell, it was going to bring his entire miserable world crashing down with it. The afternoon sun had barely begun to dip below the horizon when the heavy pounding on my front door shattered the quiet peace of my home. It had been less than 48 hours since Aaron had practically sprinted down my driveway with the decoy legal documents clutched to his chest. I was sitting in the kitchen reviewing a secure message from Fletcher regarding the final acquisition of Patricia's crushing debt portfolio. When I heard the aggressive knocking, I did not expect to see my son again so soon. I slowly stood up and made my way to the foyer. When I opened the door, I was not greeted by Aaron. It was Valerie. My daughter-in-law stood alone on my porch, and the sickeningly sweet smile she usually weaponized was completely gone. Her face was a rigid mask of cold, desperate fury. She pushed past me without waiting for an invitation, her expensive designer heels clicking sharply and aggressively against my hardwood floors. She did not bring a clearance rack grocery store cake this time. She brought pure, unadulterated venom. I could practically smell the sheer financial panic radiating off her skin. Fletcher had warned me that the walls of their fake high society empire were caving in much faster than they anticipated. The massive balloon payment on Patricia's fraudulent bridge loan was days away from total default. Valerie was cornered, and a cornered parasite is incredibly dangerous. I calmly closed the front door and followed her into the center of my living room. As I walked, I slipped my right hand deep into the pocket of my faded trousers. A visible security notice beside my front door informed every visitor that audio and video recording operated inside the common areas of the house. As Valerie entered, the system announced that recording was active. She ignored it. I pressed the save marker on my phone so Fletcher could later preserve the correct section of the home security file. Valerie spun around and crossed her arms tightly across her chest. She dropped every single exhausting pretense of being a caring family member. She told me that Aaron was being a weak, sentimental fool, pacing around their sprawling house, waiting for standard legal processing times and agonizing over banking delays. She said they absolutely did not have time to wait for a judge to validate my supposed mental decline, or for the property deed to slowly clear the county clerk offices. She needed liquid cash immediately. She looked around my modest living room with an expression of absolute, profound disgust. She demanded that I liquidate my entire remaining retirement fund and wire the cash directly into her personal checking account by the end of the week. I stood there looking at this arrogant woman who believed she held all the cards. I played the confused, heartbroken old man perfectly. I let my shoulders slump and allowed my voice to waver. I asked her why she was speaking to me with such cruelty. I asked her what happened to the loving daughter-in-law, who just wanted to make sure I was safe and comfortable in my final years. Valerie let out a harsh, cruel laugh that echoed terribly against the walls of my home. She told me to drop the pathetic old man routine immediately. She said she knew I had a private emergency fund hidden away. She knew I had been surviving on a steady retirement account, and she wanted every last penny of it right now to cover what she called emergency family investments. When I continued to play dumb, shaking my head, and telling her I could not simply empty my life savings on a whim, she delivered the ultimate killing blow. She stepped right up to my face, her eyes practically burning with greedy rage. She lowered her voice to a vicious, hissing whisper. She told me that she and Aaron were planning to start a family very soon. She stared straight into my eyes and swore on her own life that if I did not wire the money into her account immediately, she would make absolutely sure I never met my future grandchildren. She said she would banish me from their lives completely. She promised I would die alone in a miserable, bleak state-run medical facility totally forgotten and abandoned by my own bloodline. A father is supposed to feel a crushing, agonizing pain in his chest when threatened with absolute isolation from his future family. But standing there, listening to this arrogant, desperate woman try to extort me using unborn children as bargaining chips, I felt absolutely nothing but a freezing, calculated resolve. She was handing me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her publicly. The voice recorder in my pocket was capturing every single vile extortionist threat pouring out of her mouth. I let my hands tremble visibly. I let out a soft, ragged breath, pretending to be completely broken by her ruthless ultimatum. I begged her not to take my future grandchildren away from me. I told her family was the only thing I had left in this world, and I would do absolutely whatever she demanded to stay in their lives. I confessed that I did indeed have a private emergency fund, holding my entire life savings sitting in a highly secure account. I told her I could authorize a massive specialized cashier transfer that would clear instantly. The pure, greedy relief that washed over Valerie's face was genuinely sickening to witness. Her posture instantly relaxed, and the cold fury in her eyes was replaced by ravenous triumph. She demanded I go to the local bank branch with her that very minute. But I slowly shook my head, playing the stubborn, old-fashioned retiree to absolute perfection. I told her an account of that specific size required a specialized in-person withdrawal with my senior account manager, and a massive wire authorization that I could only legally execute on Friday afternoon. Valerie gritted her teeth, clearly annoyed by the delay, but desperate enough to accept the timeline. But I was not finished setting the trap. I knew for a fact that Patricia was hosting her extravagant annual charity gala this coming Saturday evening. It was a massive, lavish event Patricia funded entirely with borrowed money, just to flaunt her fake generational wealth to the city elite. It was the crown jewel of their arrogant social calendar. I looked at Valerie with wide, pleading eyes. I told her I would present the massive transfer directly to Aaron and Patricia at the gala. I suggested we disguise the massive financial bailout as a grand philanthropic family donation to her mother's charity. I said it would make Patricia look incredibly wealthy and generous in front of all her high society friends, cementing their elite status in the city while quietly saving them from their pressing financial ruin behind closed doors. Valerie's eyes lit up like fireworks. The idea of publicly showing off a massive influx of cash while secretly paying off her mother's crushing debt was simply too perfect for her arrogant, fragile ego to resist. It solved every single one of her problems. It saved her fake empire from foreclosure, and it allowed her to publicly masquerade as a wealthy philanthropist while doing it. She smiled a sharp, victorious smile, genuinely believing she had just successfully extorted a helpless old man out of his last remaining dollars. She agreed to the plan without a single ounce of hesitation. She told me to wear my absolute best suit and to not embarrass them in front of the board of directors. She warned me one last time that if I did not show up with the fully cleared funds in hand, I would never see her Aaron or my future grandchildren ever again. She turned around and marched out of my house, slamming the heavy front door behind her. I stood in the silence of my living room, reaching into my pocket to stop the recording. I played the audio back, listening to her vicious extortion crystal clear over the digital speaker. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a tall glass of cold water. Valerie thought she had just secured the ultimate victory. She had no idea she had just personally invited the Grim Reaper to her mother's most important social event of the entire decade. The gala was going to be the perfect public stage, and I was going to burn their entire fake dynasty to the ground in front of everyone they ever tried to impress. The morning air was crisp and carried the faint scent of damp earth and pine needles. I drove my old, reliable truck to the outskirts of the city, where the sprawling, ancient oak trees guarded the quietest acres of Chicago. I parked near the wrought iron gates and walked the familiar path to a small hill overlooking a serene, pristine lake. There was no massive mausoleum marking the spot, no towering marble statues to announce wealth or status. Just a simple, elegant headstone resting in the shade of a weeping willow. It simply read, "Martha Carter, beloved wife and mother." I stood before the polished stone and let out a long, heavy sigh. I took off my faded cap and held it tightly against my chest. 45 years ago, I brought Martha to a cramped, freezing apartment on the south side. We had absolutely nothing but a shared dream and a relentless, unyielding work ethic. I spent my days covered in thick black motor oil, destroying my knuckles in a local auto shop, while she worked double shifts at a corner diner, just to keep the heat running during those brutal Midwestern winters. We saved every single dime in a rusted tin coffee can under our creaky mattress. We were exhausted and we were poor, but we were fiercely happy. We had our honor and we had each other. I remembered the late nights sitting at our tiny scratched kitchen table, drawing endless blueprints under a flickering overhead light. I remembered the exact moment the design for the pneumatic pressure valve finally clicked into place. I remembered the sheer terror and the dizzying exhilaration when the patent was finally approved, and the first major automotive manufacturer called to buy the exclusive licensing rights. The tin coffee can under the mattress was suddenly replaced by offshore trusts and compounding interest portfolios. We went to sleep one night as struggling working-class kids and woke up as silent millionaires. But I also remembered the profound fear in Martha's eyes the day the first massive 7-figure deposit hit our new accounts. She did not want to buy a sprawling mansion in the wealthy suburbs. She did not want to wear diamonds or attend lavish high-society galas. She sat me down at that same scratched kitchen table, grabbed my oil-stained hands, and made me swear a solemn, unbreakable vow. She told me that unearned wealth is a highly toxic poison that rots a family from the inside out. She said money creates monsters out of weak men, and she absolutely refused to let our sudden fortune turn our future children into hollow, arrogant parasites. We agreed right then and there to build a quiet, modest life. We would provide stability and a solid education, but we would never hand our son a silver spoon. We wanted Aaron to know the absolute value of a hard-earned dollar. I knelt down on the damp grass and brushed a fallen yellow leaf away from her name carved deeply into the stone. My chest tightened with a suffocating grief that had nothing to do with her passing and everything to do with the man our son had become. We tried so incredibly hard to protect him, Martha, I whispered into the quiet morning air. We hid the empire to keep his soul intact, but the greedy world got its claws into him anyway. He did not inherit my work ethic or your gentle grace. He looked at our modest home and felt nothing but bitter embarrassment. He saw my faded suits and felt deep, arrogant shame. He chased the exact venomous high society lifestyle we had spent decades desperately avoiding. He married a woman who measures human worth in luxury car leases and designer handbags. He aligned himself with a mother-in-law who funds her entire fake elite existence on a house of cards built from predatory debt. And worst of all, he was completely willing to throw his own father into a state-run facility and steal the home we built together just to maintain his pathetic, miserable illusion of wealth. I thought about the time Aaron was a teenager, complaining bitterly that we did not drive a luxury car like his classmates' parents. I remembered Martha sitting him down and telling him that true wealth is measured by the content of a man's character and not the emblem on his steering wheel. Aaron had simply rolled his eyes and walked away. The entitlement had already taken root back then, growing silently in the dark corners of his mind. I had spent the last 10 years since Martha's passing trying to be the supportive father, attempting to guide him back to the light. I had paid his hidden debts, assuming it was a temporary stumble. I had funded his fake lifestyle, hoping he would eventually mature and realize the emptiness of his choices. But giving a parasite more blood only makes it hungrier. My financial support did not save him. It enabled his absolute moral decay. Martha would have been absolutely horrified by Valerie using unborn children as a twisted bargaining chip. Martha believed that family was a sacred bond never to be leveraged or held hostage for financial gain. Hearing Valerie spit those threats in our living room was the final ultimate confirmation that the bloodline of our family was being poisoned. I could not allow our legacy to be funneled into the hands of a woman who viewed a child as a tool for extortion. By protecting my wealth, I was protecting the very principles Martha and I held dear. I was ensuring that the millions generated by my sweat and Martha's unwavering faith would never be used to finance the cruel vanity of people like Valerie and Patricia. I closed my eyes and let the cool wind wash over my face. I thought about the extortion Valerie had hurled at me yesterday. They believed I was a weak, helpless victim completely at their mercy. But Martha always knew the absolute truth about me. She knew that beneath the quiet, simple exterior was a titan who built a global manufacturing monopoly from a dirty garage. She knew I was a man who understood exactly how to systematically dismantle an opponent piece by piece. I placed my hand flat against the cold, smooth granite of her headstone. I am going to end it. Martha, I promised, my voice steady and completely devoid of any lingering doubt. I am going to tear down their entire fraudulent dynasty. I am not doing it out of spite or blind vengeance. I am doing it because the boy we raised is gone, and the arrogant stranger standing in his place needs to learn the harsh, brutal reality of the world he chose. I am going to let them taste the absolute panic of true poverty. I am going to cut the strings forever. I slowly stood up, feeling a profound sense of closure settle deep into my bones. The grief and the lingering parental guilt had been entirely burned away, leaving only pure, cold strategy. The charity gala was tomorrow night. Patricia and Valerie were likely spending this very moment picking out extravagant designer gowns and rehearsing their arrogant philanthropic speeches. Aaron was likely sweating through his tailored suit, desperately praying that my supposed life savings would clear in time to save his house from foreclosure. They were all marching blindly toward a spectacular public execution of their pride. I put my faded cap back on my head and looked out over the quiet, pristine lake one last time. I had honored Martha's wish for decades, living quietly in the shadows to protect our family from the corrupting influence of our fortune. Now it was finally time to step out of those shadows. The Titan was waking up, and he was bringing a financial storm they could not possibly survive. I turned my back on the peaceful rolling hills of the cemetery and walked slowly toward my truck, entirely ready to prepare the absolute destruction of their fake high society empire. The invitation arrived via a private courier exactly 2 days before the event. It was a heavy cream-colored envelope sealed with gold wax and stamped with the arrogant emblem of Patricia's fake philanthropic foundation. I stood on my porch, holding the envelope, letting the absolute irony wash over me. Valerie had practically screamed at me in my own living room, threatening to banish me from my future grandchildren's lives if I did not liquidate my life savings by the end of the week. Now they were formally inviting me to present my extorted money at the social event of the season. They truly believed they had completely broken me. I walked back inside my quiet home and opened the envelope. The invitation was a masterclass in aggressive high society posturing. It demanded black tie attire and proudly listed Patricia as the sole visionary chairwoman of the annual Children's Hospital Gala. I knew for a fact that Patricia did not actually care about the Children's Hospital. She only cared about the glossy magazine photographs, the fawning local media coverage, and the desperate illusion that she was a towering pillar of generational wealth. I picked up my mobile phone and called Fletcher. The call connected instantly. Fletcher confirmed that the acquisition was in its final stage. Patricia's creditor had accepted the offer from our licensed acquisition company, subject only to verification of the assignment documents. The balloon payment remained unpaid, and Patricia had responded by taking a final emergency loan to cover the gala's vendors and preserve the appearance of solvency. She had not pledged my power of attorney documents as collateral. The lender had advanced the money against Patricia's personal guarantee projected charitable pledges, and the remaining equity, she claimed, existed in her estate. That distinction mattered. Aaron's packet could not legally support Patricia's private loan, and I did not want our later case contaminated by a transaction no competent lender would have approved. "Will the assignment close before the gala?" I asked. "Before the first speech," Fletcher replied. Once the assignment was complete, my company would become Patricia's principal creditor. We would have the right to demand payment, enforce the default provisions, and petition a court for a receiver if she continued moving or concealing assets. We would not own the mansion instantly. We would own the debt that could lawfully bring the mansion under court control. That was enough. I ended the call and looked at the invitation again. Patricia believed the gala would buy her one more week of admiration. Instead, it would become the moment her creditors, donors, and social circle learned that the image she had built could no longer survive the arithmetic beneath it. I walked upstairs to my bedroom and opened the heavy wooden door of my closet. I pushed aside the rows of crisp tailored suits I had secretly worn during my decades as a corporate titan. I reached far into the back and pulled out the old faded gray suit. The exact suit Aaron always complained about. The suit, Valerie said, made me look like a cheap, broken mechanic. I draped it over the edge of my bed. I was not going to dress like a millionaire for this gala. I was going to give them exactly what they expected. I was going to walk into that extravagant ballroom, looking like the pathetic, helpless old man they thought they were effortlessly exploiting. The next 48 hours moved with agonizing slowness. I spent the time reviewing the financial dossiers Fletcher sent over, studying every miserable detail of Aaron, Valerie, and Patricia's fake empire. Aaron was dodging frantic calls from collection agencies regarding his leased luxury cars. Valerie was maxing out a new hidden credit card just to buy a designer gown for the gala. Patricia was frantically assuring the catering company that the massive final payment would clear the moment the event concluded. They were all drowning in a sea of terrifying debt, smiling through gritted teeth, while they desperately waited for my money to save them. On Saturday evening, the sky over Chicago was a deep, bruised purple as I pulled my old, reliable truck out of the driveway. I did not hire a private driver. I did not call a black car service. I drove myself, navigating the busy city streets toward the towering illuminated facade of the Grand Hotel. As I approached the valet stand, a young attendant in a crisp uniform immediately stepped forward to open my door. He did not judge my old truck or my faded gray suit. He treated me with absolute professional respect. It was a stark contrast to the venomous treatment I received from my own blood. I handed him the keys and walked slowly toward the towering glass doors of the hotel lobby. The lobby was buzzing with the city's elite. Women in shimmering gowns and men in sharp, expensive tuxedos glided across the polished marble floors. The air smelled of expensive perfume and quiet, untouchable money. I shuffled slightly, letting my shoulders slump, perfecting the image of the intimidated, out-of-place retiree. I approached the grand, sweeping staircase leading up to the main ballroom. At the top of the stairs stood the welcoming committee. Patricia was holding court, bathed in the flashing lights of local event photographers. She wore a stunning emerald green gown, dripping with diamonds, that I now knew were heavily leveraged. She was laughing loudly, her sharp, arrogant voice echoing over the soft string music drifting from the ballroom. Standing slightly behind her were Aaron and Valerie. Aaron looked miserable. His tailored tuxedo fit perfectly, but his face was pale and drawn tight with exhausting financial stress. He was nervously scanning the crowd, desperately searching for me. Valerie stood beside him, clutching a crystal champagne flute. Her smile was tight and completely artificial. I gripped the polished wooden handrail and slowly began to climb the stairs. I made sure my steps were slow and slightly unsteady. I wanted them to see exactly what they believed I was. A broken, tired old man walking blindly into their trap, carrying the life savings that would save their miserable fake dynasty. Aaron spotted me first. His eyes widened, and he immediately nudged Valerie. Patricia turned her head, following their gaze. The arrogant smile completely vanished from her face when she saw my faded gray suit. I could practically see the disgust radiating off her. She plastered on a tight, terrifyingly fake smile and stepped forward to intercept me before I could ruin her perfect photographs. The Grim Reaper had officially arrived at the party, and they had absolutely no idea that I held the scythe. The air in the grand ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and imported white orchids. I reached the top of the sweeping marble staircase and stepped into the dazzling light of the crystal chandeliers. The string orchestra was playing a soft classical melody that floated over the hum of $100 conversations. I stood there in my faded gray suit, looking exactly like the worn-out relic they believed me to be. Patricia moved with the speed of a striking viper. The moment her eyes locked onto my outdated jacket, her brilliant philanthropic smile turned into a mask of pure panic. She abandoned the local society photographers and marched directly toward me. Valerie and Aaron were close behind her. Aaron looked absolutely sick. His tailored tuxedo could not hide the way his shoulders slumped or the terrified sweat shining on his forehead. He knew his entire fake luxury life was hanging by a single thread. Patricia intercepted me before I could take more than 3 steps into the main reception area. She did not offer a hug or a polite greeting. She immediately positioned her body to block me from the view of the flashing cameras. "Leon, what on earth are you wearing?" She hissed, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper that barely disguised her absolute fury. "This is a black-tie charity gala, not a hardware store retirement party. You are going to humiliate us in front of the entire board of directors." I let my shoulders stoop a little lower. I looked down at my scuffed shoes and offered a weak, trembling smile. I told her it was my best suit and that I wanted to look nice for her important night. I played the confused, lonely old man, perfectly letting my voice crack just enough to sound pathetic. Valerie stepped up right beside her mother. She grabbed my arm with a grip so tight, her manicured nails dug painfully through the thin fabric of my old jacket. She leaned in close, bringing the scent of heavy, expensive perfume right to my face. "Drop the pathetic act, Leon," she whispered harshly. "Did you bring the transfer authorization? Tell me you brought the banking documents, or I swear to you I will have security throw you out into the street right now." I looked at her with wide, innocent eyes. I patted the inner breast pocket of my jacket with a shaky hand. I told her the transfer documents were completely finalized and folded safely right next to my heart. I promised her the massive sum she demanded was ready to be presented whenever they needed it. The sheer greedy relief that washed over their faces was utterly sickening. Patricia closed her eyes for a brief second, letting out a heavy breath she had clearly been holding for days. She thought her toxic bridge loan was finally cured. She thought the foreclosure on her sprawling estate had been magically erased by the foolish generosity of a broken old man. Aaron finally spoke up, his voice weak and trembling. He told me to just keep a low profile and enjoy the music. He could not even look me in the eye. The boy I had raised with such fierce devotion was standing there watching his wife and mother-in-law treat me like absolute garbage, and he did absolutely nothing to stop it. He was a coward protecting his own fake empire at the expense of his own father. Patricia quickly took control of the situation. She told Valerie to escort me to my seat immediately before any of the major donors noticed my dreadful outfit. She spun around, pasting her radiant fake smile back onto her face, and marched right back to the flashing cameras and the wealthy socialites. She went back to pretending she was a towering titan of generational wealth. Valerie kept her tight, bruising grip on my arm. She did not lead me into the glittering center of the ballroom, where the elite guests were sipping vintage champagne and laughing. She steered me sharply away from the massive floral arrangements and the heavily decorated VIP tables. We walked past rows of beautiful silk-covered tables filled with important people who did not even glance in my direction. She dragged me toward the absolute back of the massive room. We walked until the light from the chandeliers grew dim and the music from the orchestra was drowned out by the clattering sounds of the kitchen staff. She stopped at a tiny cramped table shoved right next to the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. It was the worst seat in the entire building. It was a table meant for discarded coats or exhausted staff members, not for the man who was supposedly donating his entire life savings to save their family. Sit here and do not move, Valerie commanded, her voice dripping with sheer venom. Do not talk to the other guests. Do not try to mingle. When the time comes for the donation announcements, Aaron will come and collect the paperwork from you. Until then, you are completely invisible. Do you understand me? I looked at the miserable little table, and then up at my arrogant daughter-in-law. I nodded slowly, offering her another weak, obedient smile. I told her I understood perfectly and that I would stay completely out of her way. She let go of my arm, wiped her hand on her expensive silk gown, as if touching me had physically contaminated her, and walked quickly back toward the glittering center of the room. I sat down on the hard wooden chair. The swinging kitchen doors slammed open and shut beside me as busy waiters rushed past carrying silver trays of caviar and roasted duck. The noise was loud, and the draft from the kitchen was cold, but I did not mind at all. I sat in the shadows and watched the spectacular illusion they had built. I looked across the vast ballroom and saw Patricia laughing loudly with a group of wealthy investors. I saw Valerie posing for a photograph holding a crystal flute of champagne. I saw Aaron desperately wiping sweat from his forehead while trying to impress a local politician. They were entirely consumed by their own arrogant vanity. They were dancing on the deck of a sinking ship and celebrating their own brilliance. I reached into the pocket of my faded trousers and felt my mobile phone vibrate softly. It was a single silent notification. I pulled the device out and glanced at the screen. The message was from Fletcher. He was sitting in a sleek black town car parked directly across the street from the Grand Hotel entrance. The message contained only 3 words: "The trap is locked." I slipped the phone back into my pocket and smoothed the lapels of my old gray suit. I leaned back in the uncomfortable chair and let a genuine cold smile spread across my face. Fletcher had the heavily documented foreclosure papers sitting right in his lap. He had the complete, undeniable proof of their crippling fraudulent debts printed and ready for public distribution. The holding company had fully transferred the rights. I now legally owned every single thing Patricia and Valerie claimed as their own. They thought they had hidden the embarrassing old mechanic in the dark corner of the room. They thought they had successfully extorted a helpless fool. They had absolutely no idea that I was simply waiting in the shadows, giving them enough rope to hang themselves in front of the entire city. The music swelled, and the lights dimmed slightly for the main speeches. I sat quietly next to the kitchen doors, listening to the clinking glass and the arrogant laughter, preparing to walk into the light and burn their miserable fake dynasty to the absolute ground. The grand ballroom began to shift its energy. The soft string music faded into silence. A tall man in a tailored tuxedo tapped a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp ringing sound cut through the heavy murmur of wealthy conversations. The bright overhead chandeliers dimmed perfectly, leaving only the warm glow of the table candles and a single brilliant spotlight aimed directly at the center stage. I sat in my hard wooden chair by the swinging kitchen doors. I watched the elite guests turn their expensive chairs toward the front. The waiters stopped moving. The room held its breath. It was time for the main event. It was time for the grand illusion to take center stage. Patricia walked up the carpeted steps to the elevated platform. She moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a queen ascending her throne. Her heavy emerald gown sparkled under the harsh white spotlight. The diamonds around her neck caught the light blindingly. I knew those diamonds were leveraged against a toxic bridge loan she could not possibly repay. But to the hundreds of people staring up at her, she was the absolute picture of untouchable generational wealth. She grabbed the microphone from the stand with perfectly manicured hands. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause. She let the clapping wash over her, closing her eyes for a brief second to absorb the unearned adoration. She smiled a wide, brilliant smile that completely hid the terrifying financial panic burning inside her chest. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her voice echoing powerfully through the massive speakers. Her tone was smooth and practiced, dripping with fake humility. We are gathered here to support the Children's Hospital. We are here to give back to the city that has given my family so much. I listened to her spin a beautiful woven web of lies. She spoke about philanthropy as if it were her life mission. She talked about the importance of charity and sacrifice. She did not care about the hospital. The entire gala was a desperate vanity project designed to convince her wealthy peers that her checking accounts were not entirely frozen. She paused dramatically, placing a hand over her heart. She told the room that giving back was a tradition her family had upheld for generations. She claimed it was a legacy of financial brilliance and moral superiority. Patricia turned her body slightly, gesturing toward the most expensive table in the very front row. The spotlight shifted just enough to illuminate Valerie and Aaron. Valerie sat perfectly straight, projecting the image of a flawless, high-society heiress. Aaron looked like a man standing on a trapdoor. He smiled, but his face was slick with terrified sweat. Patricia raised her voice, projecting absolute pride. "I want to take a moment to acknowledge my beautiful daughter Valerie and my brilliant son-in-law Aaron," she announced. The crowd offered a polite, warm round of applause. Patricia continued weaving her magnificent delusions. "Aaron has been a revelation to our family. His corporate brilliance and his masterful executive investments have guided our portfolio to new, incredible heights. He represents the very best of the modern financial titan." I sat in the dark shadows by the kitchen doors and slowly shook my head. The corporate brilliance she was praising was a complete fabrication. The masterful investments she boasted about were nothing more than Aaron secretly draining my automated bank transfers to pay for his leased luxury cars. He had no portfolio. He had no executive power. He was a desperate drowning rat swimming in an ocean of terrifying debt. Patricia was standing in front of the most powerful people in Chicago and staking her entire family reputation on the fictional success of a man who was completely broke. She was digging the grave so deep neither of them would ever be able to climb out. Then Patricia made the greatest miscalculation of her entire arrogant life. She decided she needed to look like a truly benevolent and gracious host. She wanted to show the wealthy crowd that her family was so incredibly kind, they even welcomed the lowly lower class into their glowing elite circle. Patricia shielded her eyes from the bright spotlight and peered out across the massive dark ballroom. She looked past the silk-covered tables and the massive floral centerpieces. She looked all the way to the miserable, cramped table shoved next to the noisy kitchen doors. "We also have a very special guest with us tonight," she said, her voice dropping into a soft, patronizing coo. It was the exact tone a person might use when speaking to a lost, confused child. Aaron brought his father Leon to join us. Leon is a simple, retired mechanic. He is a man who worked hard with his hands his entire life just to get by. The spotlight suddenly swung violently across the room. The blinding white beam hit me directly in the face. Hundreds of heads turned in their expensive chairs, trying to spot the poor old man sitting in the absolute back of the room. I sat perfectly still in my faded gray suit, bathed in the harsh, bright light, for the entire city elite to see. Patricia leaned closely into the microphone, her voice echoing with sickening, sweet pity. "Leon does not have much, but today he was so moved by our family mission that he decided to hand over his entire modest life savings to our charitable foundation. He emptied his small retirement account just to be a part of our beautiful legacy. It is a tiny contribution compared to our major donors, but it is every single penny he has left in the world. Let us give this sweet, simple man a warm round of applause for his touching little sacrifice." The ballroom erupted into polite, pitying applause. Men in $10,000 tuxedos and women in priceless gowns looked back at me with soft, condescending smiles. They clapped for the poor, broken father who was supposedly donating his last few dollars to his wealthy superior-in-laws. They thought it was a charming, pathetic little story. Patricia smiled triumphantly from the stage. She expected me to shrink back into the shadows. She expected me to offer a weak, trembling wave and lower my head in absolute submission. Valerie glared at me from the front row, her eyes silently commanding me to stay seated and keep my mouth completely shut. Aaron stared at his dinner plate, looking like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. They wanted me to stay in the dark. They wanted me to accept the public humiliation and hand over my supposed meager savings in total silence. I did not wave. I did not lower my head. I placed my hands flat on the hard wooden table and pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished floor. The sound was sharp and violent, piercing right through the fading, polite applause. I stood up to my full height. I straightened my faded gray suit and buttoned the front of my old jacket. I looked directly through the blinding beam of the spotlight, locking my eyes onto Patricia standing on the grand stage. The polite applause died away almost instantly. The wealthy guests looked confused. A murmur began to ripple through the massive room. This was not part of the script. The poor old mechanic was supposed to stay in his corner. I stepped away from the kitchen doors. I began to walk down the long, wide aisle dividing the grand ballroom. My rough, scuffed shoes hit the marble floor with a slow, heavy, rhythmic thud. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, absolute certainty of a titan marching into battle. The wealthy guests leaned back in their chairs, pulling their silk gowns away as I passed them. The sea of elite socialites slowly parted, making a wide, clear path for me. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on the stage. I watched the triumphant smile slowly melt off Patricia's face. Her expression morphed from arrogant confidence to rigid confusion, and finally to sheer, unadulterated panic. She gripped the microphone stand so tightly, her knuckles turned completely white. She looked down at Valerie, demanding silent answers, but Valerie was frozen in her chair, her mouth hanging slightly open in total shock. Aaron finally lifted his head. When he saw me marching down the center aisle, looking completely devoid of fear, his face contorted in pure, absolute terror. He knew exactly what kind of man I truly was deep down. He knew I was not a victim. He knew he had pushed me too far. I reached the front of the ballroom. I walked past the massive VIP tables, ignoring the shocked gasps of the city elite. I stepped onto the carpeted stairs and began to climb the elevated platform. Patricia took a panicked step backwards, completely abandoning the microphone stand. Her heavy emerald gown rustled loudly in the dead silent room. I stepped into the center of the brilliant white spotlight. I reached out and took the microphone directly into my calloused hand. I looked out over the sea of shocked faces and then down at my trembling son. The shadow game was officially over. It was time for the entire world to learn the brutal, unforgiving truth. Valerie leaped from her front row chair the moment I stepped onto the elevated platform. Her heavy silk gown rustled loudly as she rushed up the short carpeted staircase. She intercepted me before I could reach the center of the stage. She grabbed my arm with that same bruising grip she had used earlier by the kitchen doors. Her face was flushed red with absolute panic, and her breathing was shallow and rapid. She leaned in close to my ear, bringing the heavy, suffocating scent of her expensive perfume right to my face. She hissed at me to sit down immediately. She told me I was going to ruin everything her family had built, and that I needed to hand her the bank transfer papers right now and walk away quietly. I did not look at her. I did not shrink back or apologize. I simply planted my feet firmly on this wooden stage and flexed my arm. The sudden, rigid strength in my posture caught her completely off guard. She stumbled back a step, losing her tight grip on my jacket. I turned my head and looked her dead in the eyes. I told her the time for whispering in the shadows was completely over. I stepped past her and wrapped my hand around the cool metal of the microphone. I adjusted the stand slightly, pulling it closer to my mouth. I looked out over the sea of wealthy socialites and powerful investors. The room was so quiet I could hear the soft breathing of the people sitting in the front row. I cleared my throat. My voice echoed through the massive speakers, booming with absolute clarity across the grand ballroom. I introduced myself properly to the city elite. I told them my name was Leon Carter, I told them Patricia was right about one specific thing. I told them I am a retired mechanic and that I worked hard with my hands for 40 years. But I told them she was entirely wrong about my life savings. I told the room that I was not standing on this stage to donate my last few pennies to her fraudulent charity foundation. I was standing there to correct a massive, arrogant delusion. I looked down at Aaron sitting in the front row. He was physically shrinking in his expensive chair, covering his mouth with a trembling hand. I told the crowd that Patricia had just spent 10 minutes praising my son for his corporate brilliance and his masterful executive investments. I let out a slow, heavy sigh that amplified through the room. I told the wealthy guests that Aaron was an absolute fraud. I explained that his sprawling mansion, his luxury leased cars, and his designer suits were not paid for by a brilliant corporate salary. I revealed that for the past 3 years, Aaron had been secretly surviving on automated monthly bank transfers funded entirely by the retired mechanic he was so deeply ashamed of. A collective gasp rippled through the elite crowd. Investors and socialites began whispering frantically to each other, exchanging looks of total shock. Patricia looked like she was going to faint right there on the stage. She grabbed the edge of the wooden podium to keep her balance, her face completely drained of color. I turned my attention to Valerie. She was standing frozen on the edge of the stage, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I told the room that my daughter-in-law loved to project the image of a wealthy heiress. I told them she treated the restaurant staff and the working class like absolute garbage because she believed her status made her untouchable. I revealed that Valerie had completely maxed out hidden premium credit cards just to buy her designer gowns and keep up appearances. I told the room that her entire life was a pathetic, hollow lie built on suffocating consumer debt. I told the audience that Aaron and Valerie did not invite me tonight because they loved me or wanted to include me in their celebration. I explained that when their massive debts finally caught up with them and their bank accounts were frozen, they came to my modest house begging for a bailout. I told the crowd that they tried to force me to sign away the deed to my home. They wanted to lock me away in a state-run medical facility so they could liquidate the house I built with my late wife. The ballroom went completely silent again. The wealthy elite were staring at my family with pure, unadulterated disgust. Valerie finally found her voice. She screamed across the stage, telling the crowd I was a lying, senile old man. She pointed a shaking finger at me and demanded that someone call security to remove me from the building. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with her. I simply reached into the pocket of my faded gray trousers and pulled out my mobile phone. I told the room that I anticipated they might try to call me a liar. I opened my audio recording application. I held the speaker of my phone directly against the microphone. I pressed play. The sound of Valerie speaking echoed through the entire ballroom. Her vicious, cruel voice filled the space crystal clear over the massive sound system. Everyone heard her threaten me. They heard her demand that I liquidate my entire remaining retirement fund and wire the cash directly into her personal checking account. They heard her swear on her own life that if I did not hand over the money, she would make absolutely sure I never met my future grandchildren. They heard her promise that I would die alone in a miserable, bleak facility totally forgotten by my own bloodline. I stopped the recording and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I looked at Valerie. She was completely destroyed. The wealthy socialites she had spent years desperately trying to impress were looking at her like she was a monster. Several major donors at the front tables stood up from their chairs, shaking their heads in absolute disgust. Aaron put his head down on the table, unable to look at anyone. Patricia let out a loud, pathetic sob, her grand philanthropic image burned to absolute ash. I leaned close to the microphone one last time. I told Aaron that my late wife and I had worked our entire lives to give him a solid foundation. I told him we wanted him to build a life of honor and integrity. I told him he chose to build a fake empire of greedy lies instead. I announced to the entire ballroom that the automated safety net was permanently destroyed. I told Aaron he was officially cut off from my invisible labor forever. I stepped away from the podium, leaving the microphone standing in the center of the stage. I turned around and walked slowly down the carpeted stairs. The silence in the room was heavier than ever. I had shattered their grand illusion completely, and the absolute best part of my plan was still waiting outside in the dark. Patricia broke the heavy silence with a piercing scream. Her voice was shrill and frantic, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers and echoing against the marble pillars. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my chest. She demanded that the hotel security immediately remove me from her grand ballroom. Her face was flushed with a terrifying shade of crimson, and her expensive emerald gown seemed to swallow her shaking frame. She turned desperately to the wealthy investors and elite socialites sitting in the front rows. She told them I was nothing but a delusional, broke old man. She shrieked that my mind had completely rotted away and that I was suffering from severe, senile paranoia. She promised the stunned crowd that she would have me committed to a high-security psychiatric ward before the night was over. She claimed the audio recording was a cheap fabrication meant to extort her flawless family. She was spiraling into absolute madness, trying to rebuild her shattered high society image with loud, desperate lies. I did not flinch or take a single step backward. I stood at the bottom of the carpeted stairs and let her scream until her lungs were completely empty. The wealthy guests did not rally to her defense. They simply stared at her with profound discomfort and mounting disgust. They saw right through her frantic performance. A woman with true untouchable power never needs to scream so desperately to prove her worth. Just as Patricia paused to catch her ragged breath, the massive mahogany doors at the absolute back of the ballroom swung wide open. The heavy brass handles hit the walls with a deep, echoing thud. Every single head in the room turned away from the screaming woman on the stage and looked toward the entrance. Fletcher walked into the brilliant light of the chandeliers. He did not look like a lost guest or a random hotel employee. He looked like an apex predator entering a feeding ground. He wore a flawless, tailored charcoal suit, and his silver hair was combed back with absolute precision. In his right hand, he carried a thick, dark leather binder. He walked down the center aisle with long, measured strides, following the exact same path I had cleared just moments before. The elite socialites parted for him, instantly recognizing the undeniable aura of a man who handled billions of dollars before his morning coffee. Patricia stared at him with wide, terrified eyes. Her voice trembled as she demanded to know who he was and how he had gotten past her exclusive security detail. Fletcher did not acknowledge her frantic questions. He did not even look at Aaron or Valerie, who were now clinging to each other in absolute, silent terror. He walked directly up to me and offered a slow, respectful nod. He turned to face the elevated platform and climbed the short, carpeted stairs with terrifying calm. Fletcher stopped right in front of Patricia. He held out the heavy, dark leather binder and waited for her to take it. She hesitated, her hands shaking so violently the diamond bracelets on her wrists clinked together. She slowly reached out and took the binder as if it were a live explosive. Fletcher introduced himself in a smooth, freezing tone that carried effortlessly across the dead, silent ballroom. He told her his name and informed the entire crowd that he was the senior managing partner of the most exclusive wealth management firm in the city. He stated plainly that he served as my primary financial advisor and personal legal counsel. A fresh wave of shocked whispers washed over the elite crowd. They looked at my faded gray suit and then at the incredibly powerful man standing on the stage declaring his absolute loyalty to me. Fletcher instructed Patricia to open the binder. She fumbled with the leather cover, pulling it back to reveal the thick stack of crisp legal documents inside. The color completely vanished from her face, leaving her looking like a hollow ghost. Her eyes darted frantically across the top page, reading the bold black letters printed there. It was the formal, undisputed declaration of her massive defaulted bridge loan. I stepped forward and let my voice carry through the silent room. Without the aid of a microphone, I told Patricia to look very closely at the signature on the acquisition line. I explained to the wealthy crowd that Patricia loved to pretend she was a titan of generational wealth. I told them her entire lavish existence was actually funded by a toxic, suffocating cycle of predatory borrowing. I revealed that the diamonds around her neck, the sprawling estate she lived in, and the very ballroom we were standing in were all paid for with high-interest cash advances she could never possibly repay. Valerie let out a quiet, pathetic sob, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. Aaron closed his eyes and lowered his head, knowing the absolute end had finally arrived. I told Patricia that she had missed her massive balloon payment earlier this week. I explained that her primary creditor, an aggressive holding company based out of New York, had officially prepared to seize all her assets and publicly ruin her name. I watched her knees buckle slightly as the crushing weight of reality finally set in. She tried to speak, but only a weak, hollow gasp escaped her lips. I took another slow, deliberate step toward the stage. I told her that she and my daughter-in-law had made a catastrophic miscalculation when they invited me to this gala. They thought they could bully a tired old mechanic into handing over his modest retirement pension to save their sinking ship. They thought they could extort me by using my future grandchildren as leverage. They believed I was a helpless fool, stumbling blindly into their brilliant trap. I told the entire ballroom that I was not a simple retired mechanic. I revealed that 40 years ago I designed and patented a specialized pneumatic pressure valve used in almost every major automotive manufacturing plant in the country. I explained that my late wife and I had chosen to live a quiet, modest life to protect our son from the exact greedy corruption that had just destroyed his marriage. I told them that the invisible offshore trusts funding Aaron and his fake luxury lifestyle were entirely mine. Then I delivered the final lethal blow. I looked Patricia dead in the eyes and told her that I was the primary stakeholder of the holding company that just called in her massive debts. Patricia dropped the heavy leather binder. It hit the wooden stage with a loud, terrifying crack, scattering the crisp legal documents across her expensive shoes. She stumbled backwards, gripping the podium to keep herself from collapsing onto the floor. I told her I did not come to her extravagant charity event to donate my small life savings to her fake foundation. I came to inform her that I had personally purchased her entire debt portfolio. I told Patricia that my acquisition company now lawfully held her defaulted bridge loan and every enforcement right attached to it. I did not own her estate that night, but she no longer controlled the creditor standing between herself and foreclosure. Fletcher had already issued the formal notice of default. The contractual cure period had begun, and any attempt to conceal transfer or further encumber the property would result in an immediate petition for a court-appointed receiver. If she failed to cure the default, we would proceed through the lawful foreclosure process. The estate vehicles pledged under the loan and traceable accounts would be inventoried under court supervision. "You do not have 48 hours to disappear," I said. "You have the exact period stated in the contract to produce funds you do not possess." Fletcher placed the notice before her. "When that period expires, the court not. I will decide how quickly you lose control of the estate." Patricia stared at the document. The outcome was no longer instant, but it was unavoidable. The creditor she had expected to intimidate or refinance had been replaced by the man she had tried to rob. The grand ballroom was perfectly silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The wealthy socialites who had fawned over Patricia just an hour ago were now staring at her with profound, absolute pity. Her entire dynasty had been burned to ashes in front of the most powerful people in the city. Her reputation was permanently, completely annihilated. Fletcher stepped down from the elevated platform and walked back to my side. He offered me a quiet, respectful nod, signaling that his work was entirely finished. The trap had been sprung, and the prey was completely crushed. I smoothed the lapels of my faded gray suit one final time. I turned my back on my trembling son, his vicious wife, and his completely ruined mother-in-law. I walked back down the long, wide aisle toward the grand exit, leaving them to choke on the toxic ashes of their own arrogant lies. The sound of my footsteps against the polished marble floor was the only rhythm left in the grand ballroom. Behind me, the fragile illusion of high society completely shattered. It started as a low, frantic murmur among the elite guests sitting at the front tables. Then it erupted into pure, absolute chaos. Wealthy investors who had just spent the entire evening shaking hands with Patricia began pushing their chairs back and rushing toward the exits. They whispered frantically to their partners, pulling out their cellular phones to call their own financial advisors. No one wanted to be photographed near a woman who had just been exposed as a massive, colossal fraud. The smell of expensive perfume was suddenly overwhelmed by the sharp, bitter scent of pure financial panic. I heard Patricia let out a loud, hollow gasp as the very people she had spent years trying to impress, physically, turned their backs on her. The wealthy socialites she called her dearest friends did not offer a single word of comfort. They looked at her scattered legal documents on the wooden stage and hurried away, treating her like a highly contagious disease. Valerie dropped to her knees on the carpeted stairs, frantically trying to gather the scattered foreclosure papers, as if holding them together could somehow glue her ruined life back into place. She was weeping loudly, her perfect makeup running down her face and staining her expensive silk gown. She called out for her husband, demanding that he help her fix the massive public humiliation. But I did not stop walking. I did not look back at the two women who had tried to throw me into a facility and steal my home. Their destruction was absolute and permanent. I reached the massive brass doors at the end of the long center aisle. The cool air from the hotel lobby touched my face. But before I could step completely out of the ballroom, I heard the heavy, frantic sound of someone running behind me. The footsteps were clumsy and desperate, slipping on the polished floor. I turned my head just slightly and saw my son Aaron sprinting down the aisle away from the stage. He did not stop to help his sobbing wife gather the papers. He did not offer a single hand to his ruined mother-in-law. When the walls of his fake luxury empire finally collapsed, his only instinct was pure, selfish survival. He abandoned the women he had conspired with the very second they ran out of leverage. Aaron caught up to me just as I reached the grand exit. He threw himself forward, grabbing the sleeve of my faded gray jacket with trembling, sweaty hands. His face was a picture of absolute, pathetic desperation. He fell heavily to his knees right there on the hard marble floor, in front of the remaining guests and the hotel staff. The confident, arrogant corporate executive was completely gone. In his place was a terrified little boy begging for a safety net he had brutally taken for granted. He looked up at me with wide, streaming eyes. He begged me to listen to him. He pleaded with me to understand that he had been manipulated and brainwashed. His voice echoed through the massive lobby, bouncing off the high ceilings for everyone to hear. He swore that the terrible plan to take my house and put me in a state-run facility was entirely the doing of Valerie and Patricia. He pointed a shaking finger back toward the stage, blaming his wife for the crushing credit card debts and the toxic luxury leases. He claimed he was just a desperate husband trying to keep his demanding family happy. He told me he never wanted to hurt me and that he was just too weak to stand up to them. He cried openly, begging me to forgive him and give him one more chance to be a good son. He promised he would divorce Valerie immediately and leave the wealthy suburbs tomorrow if I would just unlock his accounts and save him from the bouncing loans. He offered to abandon his entire life if I would just throw him a financial lifeline. I stood perfectly still and looked down at the man kneeling on the floor. A father is supposed to feel a deep, tearing pain when he sees his own child weeping in absolute despair. But as I looked at Aaron begging for my money while throwing his own wife to the wolves, I felt a profound, freezing emptiness. There was no love left in my chest for this man. There was no lingering parental guilt. I thought about my late wife, Martha, and how disgusted she would be to see the boy we raised groveling on a hotel floor, abandoning every shred of his dignity for a bank transfer. I pulled my sleeve free and looked down at him. You were not manipulated into lying to me, I said. You chose the lie because it protected the life you wanted. Aaron pointed toward Valerie and Patricia again, but I stopped him. They did not forge your voice at the restaurant. They did not force you to bring those documents into my home. They did not make you promise to protect me while you were preparing to take my house. I told him that the monthly transfers would never resume. The mortgage support vehicle guarantees emergency credit lines and hidden collateral were permanently gone. Tonight is not the moment you become poor, I said. It is the moment you become responsible for the life you purchased. He begged me to remember that we were family. Family does not exist only when the account is funded. I stepped away from him. You mod your choices in public. Now you will live with them without using me as the price of admission. He let out a loud, agonizing wail, dropping his face into his hands as the absolute reality of his ruin finally settled into his bones. He had nothing left. His marriage was destroyed. His social standing was annihilated. His bank accounts were frozen solid, and the father he had so foolishly underestimated had just completely severed the tie forever. I did not offer him a hand to help him up. I turned my back on my weeping son, leaving him broken and alone on the cold marble floor. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the Grand Hotel and stepped out into the crisp, cool evening air. Fletcher was waiting patiently by the black town car parked across the street. The city lights sparkled brilliantly in the distance. The crushing weight of the last decade had been completely lifted from my shoulders. I took a deep, clean breath, feeling the quiet, powerful peace of a titan who was finally completely free. The morning after the grand gala broke with a cold, gray sky over Chicago. I sat at my kitchen table enjoying a simple bowl of warm oatmeal. The house was perfectly peaceful. There were no frantic phone calls. There were no arrogant visitors banging on my front door. But miles away in the heart of the city, the poisonous desperation of my daughter-in-law was reaching an absolute boiling point. Valerie had spent the entire night in a cheap motel room, watching her mother collapse into a hysterical state of financial ruin. She had watched her husband Aaron sob like a broken child on the floor of the hotel lobby. Valerie despised weakness above all else. She looked at the man she married shivering in the corner of their rented room and felt nothing but pure, unadulterated contempt. She decided that if her husband was too much of a coward to secure their future, she would simply have to execute the final lethal blow herself. She remembered the heavy leather briefcase Aaron had brought home 2 days ago. Inside that briefcase were the medical and financial power of attorney documents I had signed at my dining room table. Aaron was far too terrified to use them after the spectacular public slaughter at the gala. He knew I held the power to destroy them. But Valerie was completely blinded by her own venomous arrogance. She believed that I was just a lucky old retired mechanic who had managed to buy a single debt portfolio to ruin her mother. She still truly thought my personal checking accounts and my modest retirement funds were entirely vulnerable. In a last-ditch act of sheer spiteful revenge, she decided she was going to drain every single penny I had to my name and flee the state before the foreclosure dust settled. Valerie dressed in a dark, tailored pantsuit, putting on her oversized designer sunglasses to hide her swollen red eyes. She drove straight to the largest Premier Bank branch in the downtown financial district. She marched through the heavy glass doors, completely ignoring the long line of ordinary customers, and demanded to speak directly with the senior branch manager. She weaponized her high society attitude one final time, hoping to intimidate the bank staff into immediate, unquestioning compliance. She was swiftly escorted into a private glass-walled office where she confidently dropped the thick stack of legal documents right onto the polished mahogany desk. She instructed the manager that her elderly father-in-law had suffered a catastrophic mental break the night before. She lied with chilling smoothness, claiming I was experiencing severe, dangerous delusions, and that she needed to immediately execute the power of attorney to freeze my accounts. She demanded that all my liquid assets be transferred into a secure trust under her sole control to pay for my upcoming forced medical care. The branch manager was an older man with a quiet, deeply professional demeanor. He expressed his polite sympathies for her difficult family situation. He picked up the heavy documents and began to read through the dense legal jargon. What Valerie did not know was that Fletcher had revoked the inactive power of attorney immediately after the gala and delivered the revocation to every institution holding my assets. He had also provided the bank with the document's serial number, the activation conditions, and a formal warning that Valerie or Aaron might attempt to misrepresent my capacity. When Valerie scheduled the appointment, she told the bank that she intended to transfer a substantial portion of my assets into an account she controlled. The compliance department notified the Financial Crimes Task Force, already reviewing the attempted property transfer and the recorded extortion. The branch manager entered the serial number and confirmed 3 facts. The power of attorney had never activated. It had been formally revoked. Valerie was falsely claiming that I was incapacitated while requesting a transfer for her own benefit. The manager did not trigger a magical alarm embedded in the paper. He followed the fraud response protocol established before Valerie entered the building. The manager asked Valerie to wait while the bank verified the medical certification she claimed existed. Investigators were already nearby because the appointment had been flagged in advance. After Valerie repeated the false statements in writing and signed the transfer request, the agents entered with authority under the existing financial fraud investigation. They did not tell her that presenting an invalid document automatically made her guilty. They informed her that she was being detained in connection with attempted bank fraud, false statements to a financial institution, and attempted theft subject to formal charging review. Back in my quiet kitchen, my mobile phone buzzed on the granite counter. It was Fletcher. I answered, and he delivered the news with a sharp, deeply satisfied tone. He told me the silent tripwire had just been crossed at the major downtown bank branch. Valerie had walked directly into the steel jaws of the bear trap. I took a slow bite of my oatmeal, feeling a profound sense of absolute closure. She could have simply walked away from the ruined gala and tried to rebuild a quiet, honest life. But greedy parasites never walk away from a perceived meal. I told Fletcher to let the federal authorities handle the situation completely. I did not need to be there to watch her fall. Her own arrogant actions were more than enough to seal her permanent fate. Inside the bank, the minutes ticked by slowly. Valerie was beginning to tap her expensive shoe against the carpet, growing increasingly impatient. She checked her luxury watch, clearly annoyed that stealing my life savings was taking so much of her valuable time. Finally, the heavy glass door of the private office swung open. But it was not the polite branch manager returning with the transfer confirmation and cashier checks. It was 3 tall individuals wearing dark windbreakers with federal agency insignias printed clearly on their chests. 2 armed local police officers stood right behind them, entirely blocking the only exit. The lead federal agent stepped into the small room and addressed Valerie by her full legal name. She immediately stood up, spilling her sparkling water across the glass desk. She demanded to know what was going on and began loudly threatening to call her powerful corporate lawyers. The agent did not flinch or step back. He calmly and loudly informed her that the legal documents she had just attempted to execute were flagged as completely fraudulent instruments. I explained that by presenting legally void documents across state banking networks to maliciously access heavily protected corporate trusts, she had just committed a massive federal offense. She was no longer a wealthy socialite running a family errand. She was an active suspect caught perfectly red-handed, committing attempted major bank fraud. The remaining color completely drained from Valerie's face. She looked like a ghost, standing in her expensive tailored suit. She began to stammer desperately, claiming it was a simple misunderstanding. She swore that her husband Aaron was the one who procured the paperwork. She tried to throw the man she married under the moving bus, just as quickly as he had abandoned her on the hotel floor the night before. But the federal agent simply shook his head. He told her that she was the one sitting in the bank actively attempting to execute the fraudulent wire transfer, and that made her entirely legally responsible for the crime. The agent stepped forward and instructed her to place her hands firmly behind her back. Valerie began to sob hysterically as the terrifying reality of her situation finally shattered her arrogant delusions. There was no wealthy mother to bail her out of this mess. Patricia was entirely bankrupt. There was no fake luxury empire to hide behind. She was handcuffed right there in the plush leather chair, her wrists pinned tightly together with cold, heavy steel. The clicking sound of the handcuffs locking into place echoed sharply in the small glass office. The agents led her out of the room. She was forced to walk through the crowded, bustling bank lobby during the absolute peak of the morning rush. Dozens of ordinary working-class people stopped their daily transactions to watch the supposedly wealthy, untouchable socialite being marched out in strict federal custody. Her expensive mascara was smeared down her cheeks, and her arrogant pride was completely and permanently annihilated. She had tried to deliver a final act of vicious revenge against an old man she deemed entirely worthless. Instead, she had personally handed the federal government the exact flawless evidence they needed to lock her inside a concrete cell for a very long time. The sky over the Chicago suburbs turned a brutal, bruised purple by late afternoon. A torrential downpour began to hammer against the roof of my quiet house. The heavy rain washed the streets clean, sweeping away the lingering toxic tension of the past 72 hours. I sat in my living room listening to the massive drops smacking against the window panes. I had spent the entire morning organizing my new philanthropic trusts with Fletcher, and I finally felt a profound, deep peace settling into my bones. The fire in the hearth cracked warmly, casting a soft golden light across the room. But the freezing storm outside was about to deliver one final pathetic ghost to my doorstep. The doorbell did not ring. Instead, a weak, desperate pounding echoed against the heavy oak wood of my front door. It was not the aggressive, confident knock Valerie had used just days prior when she came to extort me. It was a frantic, rhythmic thudding of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. I set my hot tea on the table and stood up slowly. I walked through the quiet, empty hallway. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open, letting the freezing wind and rain whip into the warm foyer. Aaron stood alone on the wet concrete porch. He was completely soaked to the bone. The expensive, tailored navy suit he loved to flaunt was entirely ruined, plastered to his shivering frame by the freezing rain. His premium leather shoes were coated in thick, dark mud. He had no umbrella to shield himself. He had no leather briefcase full of predatory contracts. His wet hair was plastered to his forehead, and his face was utterly, entirely broken. He looked exactly like a man who had just survived a massive, catastrophic shipwreck, only to realize there was no rescue boat coming for him. He looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. He opened his mouth, but a violent shiver racked his body before he could even speak. He finally choked out the words, telling me his entire fake world had been completely eradicated. He said the major banks had frozen every single account he possessed. He told me the repo men had shown up at his sprawling suburban estate at dawn, dragging away both of his luxury leased vehicles right in front of his wealthy, judgmental neighbors. He cried that he tried to call Valerie for help, but discovered she was sitting in a federal holding cell facing massive bank fraud charges. He sobbed that Patricia was completely locked out of her foreclosed mansion, wandering the city in the rain, trying to find a cheap roadside motel that would accept her declined credit cards. Aaron fell heavily to his knees on the wet porch. The freezing rain poured down his back, but he did not seem to care at all. He grabbed the wooden doorframe with white, terrified knuckles. He begged me to let him inside the warm house. He cried out that he was my only son, and that he had absolutely nowhere else to go in the entire world. He promised he would sleep on the hard floor. He swore he would get a minimum wage job working with his hands just like I did. He begged for a second chance, pleading with me to remember the innocent little boy I had raised so many decades ago. He shamelessly invoked his late mother, Martha, crying that she would never let her only child freeze to death on the front porch. I stood in the warm, dry foyer and looked down at my weeping son. A father should feel a crushing, desperate urge to pull his freezing child out of the terrible storm. But looking at Aaron begging for shelter, I felt a terrifying, absolute emptiness. I remembered the exact way he had laughed with Patricia in the VIP booth of that steakhouse. I remembered the exact way he had shoved those predatory legal documents across my dining table, hoping to lock me inside a psychiatric ward so he could steal the very house he was currently begging to enter. I did not raise my voice over the crashing thunder. I spoke in a low, calm, freezing tone that cut right through the noise of the pouring rain. I told Aaron to never invoke his mother again. I told him Martha would be absolutely disgusted by the cowardly hollow man kneeling on the porch. She spent her entire life teaching him the value of honesty and hard work. He chose to throw those beautiful lessons away for a shiny silver watch and the fake approval of arrogant people who treated him like garbage the moment his bank accounts dried up. Aaron sobbed harder, reaching a trembling wet hand out toward my shoes. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, putting a solid physical boundary between us. I looked him dead in the weeping eyes and told him the most painful, brutal truth a father can ever deliver to his child. I told Aaron that a man is only worth the weight of his own spine. For his entire adult life, I had been holding him up. I had secretly paid his massive debts. I had quietly funded his fake luxury. I had acted as his invisible spine, allowing him to strut around high society like a wealthy titan while he was actually nothing but a spineless parasite. I told him that as long as I kept catching him every time he fell, he would never ever learn how to stand on his own 2 feet. I told him I was not going to be his safety net anymore. I was not going to let him bring his toxic, miserable consequences into my peaceful home. He had chosen the arrogant, superficial world of his vicious wife and his greedy mother-in-law. Now he had to survive the brutal, terrifying reality of that world completely alone. Aaron screamed my name into the storm, begging me not to do it. He cried that he would not survive the night out in the cold city. I looked at him with pure, cold detachment. I told him it was finally time he learned how to walk without someone holding him up. I placed my hand on the heavy oak door. I looked at the broken, weeping boy I raised one last time. Then I pushed the door forward and let it close with a solid, heavy, resounding click. I turned the deadbolt, locking the storm and my son outside forever. I walked back into my warm, quiet living room and sat down by the crackling fire, knowing the painful, brutal surgery was finally complete. The toxic, infected limb had been permanently severed, and for the first time in a decade, I could finally breathe. The morning after the storm brought a profound, brilliant stillness to the entire city of Chicago. The torrential, freezing rain had completely washed the suburban neighborhood clean, leaving the empty streets slick and shining under the rising golden sun. I woke up at my usual time just as the early dawn light began to creep through the thin curtains of my bedroom window. I did not feel the heavy, suffocating weight that had anchored me to the mattress for the past decade. For the first time in 10 long years, I woke up feeling entirely, incredibly light. I walked downstairs into my quiet kitchen and began my daily routine. I scooped the generic dark coffee grounds into the filter and listened to the slow, rhythmic dripping of the machine. The house was completely silent. But it was not the terrifying, heavy silence of a lonely old man waiting in the dark for his phone to ring. It was the rich, vibrant silence of absolute, total peace. The toxic, infected roots that had been slowly strangling my life had been completely ripped out of the ground. The parasites were permanently gone. I poured the hot black coffee into my favorite ceramic mug and walked slowly into the dining room. The heavy oak table was completely clear. There were no fake clearance grocery store cakes sitting on the wood. There were no predatory legal documents waiting to strip me of my dignity and my home. Instead, there was a neat, highly organized stack of pristine folders left by a specialized courier early this morning. I sat down in my sturdy wooden chair and took a slow, deep sip of the bitter, dark roast, letting the heat spread evenly through my chest. Exactly at 9 in the morning, I heard a quiet, respectful knock at my front door. It was not desperate or frantic like the pounding from the days before. It was the calm, measured sound of a professional arriving to finish a masterpiece. I opened the heavy front door and found Fletcher standing on my porch. He wore a sharp, light gray suit perfectly tailored for a victorious morning. He carried a slim leather briefcase and offered me a warm, genuine smile that reached his sharp, calculating eyes. I invited him inside and we walked together back to the sunlit dining room. Fletcher opened his briefcase and laid the final binding contracts across the polished wood. We were not freezing bank accounts today. We were not foreclosing on fraudulent bridge loans or setting federal traps for arrogant socialites. We had spent the last 72 hours violently tearing down a dynasty of vicious lies, and now it was finally time to build something beautiful in its place. Fletcher explained the exact legal structure of the massive offshore fortune my late wife Martha and I had accumulated over 40 long years. The tens of millions of dollars generated by my patented automotive pressure valve were officially being moved completely out of the silent shadows. But they were not going into the pockets of high society investors or greedy, ungrateful heirs. I leaned forward and looked at the crisp, clean text printed on the very top page. It was the official legal charter for the Carter Foundation for Industrial Excellence. I looked across the table and told Fletcher that I spent my entire life working hard with my own two hands. I remembered the freezing, bitter winters in the unheated South Side auto shop, where my knuckles bled and my back ached for every single dollar I earned. I remembered the profound, burning hunger in my gut to build a stable, honorable life for my family. I told Fletcher that handing a massive, unearned fortune to a spoiled, arrogant child had been the greatest catastrophic failure of my entire life. I was never going to make that terrible, fatal mistake again. I was going to take the massive empire I built in a dirty garage and hand it back to the very people who actually understood the brutal, unforgiving value of hard, honest labor. The Philanthropic Trust was specifically designed to provide full, comprehensive scholarships to young men and women attending local trade schools and vocational academies. I wanted to fund the mechanics, the electricians, the plumbers, the carpenters, and the builders of the future. I wanted to find the working-class kids who had thick black grease under their fingernails and a relentless, unyielding fire in their hearts. I wanted to lift up the young people who woke up before the sun, who carried heavy toolboxes, who knew what it meant to earn their keep through real, tangible sweat. These were the children who actually deserved the financial safety net I had so foolishly wasted on Aaron. They would use the funds to build legitimate businesses and honest lives rather than buying fake luxury cars and pretending to be corporate titans. Fletcher handed me his heavy silver fountain pen. He watched with quiet, profound respect as I pressed the metal nib against the thick parchment. I signed my name with absolute smooth certainty. I did not let my hand tremble or shake even for a fraction of a second. I wrote with the bold, confident, sweeping strokes of a titan, reclaiming his true identity. Every single signature legally redirected millions of dollars away from the fake luxury world of country clubs and vintage champagne and funneled it directly into the callous hands of the working-class youth of Chicago. I signed page after page, feeling a massive, radiant joy filling all the empty, hollow spaces in my soul. I was finally fulfilling the sacred, unbreakable promise I had made to Martha so many decades ago. I was using our wealth to build a legacy of true, uncompromising honor. When the final heavy page was completely signed, Fletcher carefully gathered the dense legal documents and locked them safely inside his leather briefcase. He stood up from the dining table and extended his hand toward me. I stood up and shook it firmly, feeling the solid, unshakable bond of two men who had just successfully executed the greatest financial maneuver of their respective lives. Fletcher told me it had been an absolute distinct honor serving as my personal counsel during this entire brutal war. I thanked him for his brilliant, ruthless loyalty and his flawless execution of the traps we laid. I walked him to the front door and watched him stride confidently down the driveway toward his waiting black town car. The legal machinery was officially entirely in motion. My massive fortune was completely locked away in a protective, impenetrable vault of pure philanthropy. Aaron, Valerie, and Patricia could scream and cry and hire all the cheap, desperate lawyers they wanted. They would never ever touch a single, solitary penny of my legacy again. I closed the front door and walked back to the kitchen to retrieve my ceramic coffee mug. The dark liquid was still pleasantly warm. I carried it through the quiet house and unlocked the back door, stepping out onto my wide wooden porch. The morning air smelled like wet pine and fresh, clean rain. The birds were singing loudly in the sprawling ancient oak trees that lined the very back of my yard. I took a deep, clean breath, filling my lungs completely with the crisp, cool autumn air. I looked out over the green grass and the sturdy wooden fence I had built with my own 2 hands. I was 70 years old, and my life was not ending in a miserable, bleak state-run psychiatric ward. It was beginning again in the quiet, brilliant light of total, absolute freedom. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my black coffee, letting the peaceful silence wash over me. I was a man who had faced the absolute worst kind of family betrayal and walked through the terrible fire completely unburned. I had stripped away the heavy, suffocating masks I wore for decades. I had permanently cut the toxic, suffocating strings holding me down. The old, poor mechanic, the burdensome, irrelevant father, the helpless, manipulated victim. They were all completely, permanently gone. Only the Titan remained standing tall and utterly unbroken in the beautiful, absolute peace of a brand new empire. If you found value in this story, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts.